call this meeting to order. This is the 64th meeting of the Standing Committee on Finance. I want to welcome our witnesses here this afternoon. Our orders today, pursuant to the order of reference of Monday, May 14th, are a study of Bill C-38, an act to implement certain provisions of the budget tabled in Parliament on March 29th. We have four organizations with us here in this panel. Firstly, we have the Canadian Labour Congress. Ensuite, le Conseil national de chômeurs et chômeuses. Thirdly, we have the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, and then we have PPP Canada Incorporated. Thank you all for being with us here this afternoon. You will each have up to 5 minutes for an opening statement, and then we'll have questions from members. And we will begin with the Canadian Labour Congress, please.
Oops, sorry, I'm fighting with you over the mic.
Bill operating for you. Yeah.
Well, I'll try and keep it to 5 minutes. It's a pretty big bill for 5 minutes. I guess the first point I'd make is that we would have hoped that the provisions in the bill relating to the changes to old age security and employment insurance should, in our view, be removed from the bill, and there should be a separate consultation on those. I think both sets of provisions have very far-reaching ramifications. I'd also note I don't think in either case that the government has produced a really clear policy rationale for the changes, and it would be good to have that, to have a more informed debate on the issues. So I'll just make a few points very, very quickly. On employment insurance, we would certainly have a major concern regarding the new appeal process with the Social Security Tribunal. As members are probably aware, there's now about 1,000 part-time members of EI boards of referees across the country assigned to each of the EI regions. In our view, and I think in the view of employers as well, the existing system gives unemployed workers a fair and impartial process. The appeals are dealt with on a speedy basis. We don't see that 39 full-time people are going to adequately replace that in terms of an appeal process. So that concern about the loss of a fair process is of particular concern given the other provisions in the bill relating to employment insurance, which I think imply that there's going to be closer scrutiny of unemployed workers, greater expectations of them in terms of job search, the kind of work they should have. So the interaction there is of concern. I guess around the new expectations of the unemployed in terms of taking available jobs with significant wage cuts in some circumstances, it's unclear to us what the rationale is for this change. I mean, is it the case that the government thinks that unemployed workers are at the present time turning down suitable job offers or not? Most of the impact on those provisions is going to fall on workers in the higher unemployment regions. If you take the high unemployment regions in Atlantic Canada, Quebec, there's something in the range of 10 unemployed workers for every job vacancy that's reported by employers. It seems to us we're very far from a situation where there's jobs going begging because of unemployed workers turning them down. I guess the other concern is that, again, particularly in the higher unemployment regions where wages are relatively low to begin with, that these obliging some subgroup of the unemployed to take significant wage cuts could depress wages quite significantly further. With regard to the old age security and the guaranteed income supplement, again, it's unclear to us what the key objective here is. Is it to require older workers to work longer, or is it primarily to save money? If it's to make people work longer, I'd draw to the attention of the committee that the average retirement age has actually been rising over the last decade in line with rising life expectancy. So time spent in work is not falling, as is often alleged. If you look at people aged 65 to 70, now 1 in 4 in that age category are continuing to work while collecting, in the vast majority of cases, an old age security pension. There's no requirement to cease work to collect OAS. I guess to put it in a nutshell, the concern is that if we take people in that age 65 to 67 group who are going to lose access to OAS and GIS, there's a very significant subgroup in that population who rely on the guaranteed income supplement in particular to give them a barely adequate standard of living. 30% of the income of people aged 65 to 67 comes from OAS, GIS, primarily because people at the bottom end really rely on that. There's going to be some important subgroup of people who are unable to continue working past age 65 for reasons of ill health or for reasons for caring for somebody else, who are likely unable to work on to replace that important income from OIS. If we look at people aged 65 to 67 who are working now, 40% are working part-time, 40% are self-employed, often at very low incomes. So it's far from clear that people who continue to work in that age group, assuming the government wants to encourage them to do so, will be able to earn sufficient income to replace that lost OIS, GIS income. So in conclusion, I just urge that those sections of the bill related to EI and OAS, I think, deserve a more extended scrutiny than we're going to be able to give them through this process.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Jackson. We'll go Mr. Serre, s'il vous plaît, pour 5 minutes.
You have 5 minutes. Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to thank you for your invitation to make a presentation to our committee. I intend to speak solely on the part of the bill that will be affecting employment insurance, that is in this Budget Implementation Act. I must admit at the outset that we did hesitate before accepting this invitation because we did know quite well, as all of you do, that this bill, Bill C-38, will be passed as such. However, we do believe in democracy. We are in favor of democracy. We think that Quebecers and Canadians must know what the repercussions of these proposed amendments will be, because the proposed amendments will have very serious consequences. Page 372 of this bill, page 372, section or clause 605. There are only 4 lines, Mr. Chair, 4 lines to repeal clause or section 27. That is the historical definition of what an unsuitable job would be. That is a way of protecting those who are unemployed and giving them a reasonable period of time to find work in their sector of experience and activity. All of this has been repealed or will be repealed. And a non-suitable job will be considered a suitable job. What was unacceptable will henceforth be considered acceptable. Of course, Mr. Chairman, we knew that there would be a new definition for regulations governing employment insurance. These regulations are not put before Parliament. Minister Finlay did table a document last Thursday, and we understand what the spirit relating to the definition of a suitable or unsuitable job will be. This is something historic fact in the unemployment insurance system. There are 3 different types of unemployed who will no longer have the same rights and will not be subject to the same requirements. This is something that has never been seen before. We are creating a new subgroup of the unemployed that are known as frequent beneficiaries, and they will no longer have a reasonable period of time. They will have to accept any type of job at 80% of their wages. Starting in the 7th week, they will have to accept any type of employment at 70% of their previous salary. Who are these frequent beneficiaries or claimants? They are mainly seasonal workers. And where are these seasonal workers to be found? Ladies and gentlemen, they are to be found in Eastern Canada. 34% of the claimants, unemployment insurance claimants in Quebec are seasonal workers. In the Atlantic provinces in Nova Scotia, 38% of claimants are seasonal workers, 40% in New Brunswick, 19% in Ontario, in British Columbia, 14% in Alberta, 9%. This amounts to a declaration of war on Eastern Canada, penalizing those who happen to live in these areas where seasonal work is one of the dominant economic activities. Who are these frequent claimants? Generally speaking, they are people who have not had luck of having a full-time year-round job. This is the case, for example, people who are working in the cinema industry, advertising, people who are working in a school setting, support staff, people working in cafeterias. a third of the manpower in Canada, with figures from Human Resources. And we are creating then this new subgroup of people who will have to accept conditions that would be considered unacceptable elsewhere. In this same bill, and this is something that was mentioned by my colleague from the Canadian Labour Congress, there is an attempt to do away with the administrative tribunals and to replace them. And I should say that these tribunals are based on a tripartite system with the participation of representatives of the employers, the employees, to ensure a certain balance in the decision-making. All of this will be replaced by a new type of tribunal, Social Security Tribunal, with a single commissioner, and there will be 74 for all of Canada. What I would like to tell you, and it's my mandate to tell you this, that this is in the process of breaking the social contract on which employment insurance was built, which was known as unemployment insurance at one time. All observers, all commentators, all editorialists, the political class in Quebec, and we've also heard from people from the Atlantic provinces, are against these amendments or changes. And I'd like to conclude on the following words. Mr. Chairman, this government is in process of sowing the wind, and what we can expect is to see a very stormy weather in the coming.
Mr. Clemens, please.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity. I apologize for not having something written, but I was just confirmed this morning, so because of other commitments, I wasn't able to write something formal. I was asked to comment on the changes proposed to OAS, and I'll just go across some broad strokes with respect to OAS and GIS. First, I think it is a move to recognizing the demographic deficit that the country is facing. Professor Christopher Reagan did a paper for us showing that by 2040, the structural deficit that the country would face would be 4.2% of GDP, which is about $67 billion in current terms. And that's driven almost exclusively by demographic changes, so largely income transfers to seniors and healthcare expenditures. And so the changes to OAS, I think, are a step in the right direction to dealing with that deficit down the road. However, I would characterize the reforms as modest. I certainly wouldn't characterize them as radical by any stretch for several reasons. One, using the traditional definition of sustainability, the program was not sustainable because it either would require more resources or crowding out of other spending. So it wasn't sustainable if we used the traditional measure or definition. The actuary himself said that OAS and GIS spending would go from $1 in $5 to $1 in $4 by 2030, so either more taxes or crowding out of other spending would have to occur. Secondly, the increase in the age to 67 is not all that radical. If you think about it, for example, if we were to index the age of eligibility beginning in 1966 when Canada Pension was brought in, the current age of eligibility for retirement would be 74. I mean, so the move to 67, given the fairly marked increase in life expectancy over time, again, is a fairly modest change. My own writing, I suggested 69. But again, if we had just indexed it, it would have been at 74. I think something the committee should consider is creating a mechanism to index it in the future so that the age of eligibility is automatically increasing as life expectancy is increasing. Right now what happens is the value of the cost of the total benefits increases with no action simply as life expectancy is extended. Thirdly, one of the things I was disappointed about is there was no discussion about the eligibility for the benefit on OAS, not GIS, but for OAS. The fact that you get the full benefit up to almost $70,000 in income indicates to me that it's not a well-targeted program, and in an era of scarce resources, I think we could do a much better job, particularly looking at GIS and some of the concerns that Andrew raised, which I agree with on GIS. Those could be more than fully funded if we were to scale or claw back OAS at a lower level of income. As an example, a two-adult household can have income up to $140,000 of income and receive full OAS benefits. again, I think there's room there to scale that back so that we can better use those resources for lower-income seniors. And indeed, one of the real successes of Canada internationally is our ability to essentially wipe out poverty for seniors, largely through the GIS program and its interaction with OAS. And so I would suggest that that's something we should be putting on the table, is the discussion of better targeting the elderly benefits to GIS through a more aggressive clawback of the benefits on OAS. And then lastly, and again, I think I'm echoing, at least my understanding, some of the concerns from Andrew, is there are some question marks. For example, we don't know yet the interaction between the provinces on how they will respond to the gap between 65 and 67, even though the government has at least indicated some additional transfer funds. So there's a question as to what does that program look like. In addition, the interaction with the pension laws at the provincial level, I think, is a critical issue, particularly if the incentive is we want seniors to work more. What we can't have is a curtailment of benefits to encourage them to work, and then marginal tax rates over 50% because they're getting benefits scaled back if they stay in the labor force. So, for example, how does the change that has been proposed on OAS interact with the RIF guidelines on when you have to start taking income out of deferred tax accounts? These are important issues that need to be addressed in totality, and I think, unfortunately, the budget will, while, again, a good first step on OAS, I think there are some important issues that we, at the very least, need some details or some contours about it as to how they'll interact with the increase in the age of OAS. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Clemens. We'll hear from Mr. Smith now, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm pleased to be here on behalf of PPP Canada to discuss Bill C-38, an act to implement certain provisions of the budget and other measures. The infrastructure delivery model known as public-private partnerships, or P3s, has been successfully implemented through the creation of government agencies in the United Kingdom, Australia, and across Europe. To date, the provinces have led the way in the use of P3s in Canada, notably Ontario, Quebec, British Columbia, and Alberta. However, with the creation of PPP Canada, we are seeing more and more jurisdictions adopting policies and frameworks to leverage greater value for money through P3 procurement. This increase in their use has contributed to Canada becoming a recognized global leader in the P3 industry. P3s are a long-term, performance-based approach for procuring public infrastructure where the private sector assumes a major share of the responsibility in terms of risk and financing for the delivery and the performance of the infrastructure, from design to structural planning to long-term maintenance. In practical terms, this means that governments across Canada harness the innovation and expertise of the private sector to provide the most effective solution to deliver services to Canadians. Through allowing the private sector to design, build, finance, operate, and maintain such things as roads, bridges, and water and wastewater treatment facilities, it ensures that the overall cost and risk is considered up front. More importantly, governments do not pay for the asset until it is built, and a substantial portion is paid over the life of the asset, if it is properly maintained and performs its services. Moreover, the costs are fixed over the life cycle of the asset, meaning that taxpayers are not on the financial hook for cost overruns, delays, or any performance issues over the asset's life. For example, imagine that the company that built your house was also responsible for any repairs and maintenance over your 25-year mortgage. Given the amount that you will pay them every year once it is constructed is agreed to before the house is built, your payments do not go up if something breaks or needs replacement. Your builder, therefore, would consider the most cost-efficient way of doing something, perhaps installing a metal roof rather than shingles, more expensive to install but more durable and easier to and cheaper to maintain in the long run. Moreover, if your dishwasher breaks and they don't come to repair it in the agreed amount of time, you can deduct that from your next payment. The Government of Canada has recognized the potential benefits of the P3 model and created PPP Canada, a Crown corporation, to improve the delivery of public infrastructure by achieving better value, timeliness, and accountability to taxpayers through P3s. PPP Canada's operational focus is threefold: acting as a source of expertise and advice on public-private partnerships, through knowledge development and sharing that knowledge, building P3 procurement knowledge and capacity among federal departments, and leveraging greater value for money from federal investments in provincial, territorial, municipal, and First Nation infrastructure through the P3 Canada Fund. Created in our budget 2011, created a new federal P3 screen for infrastructure with capital costs of $100 million or more and a useful life of at least 20 years. Federal departments are now required to evaluate the potential for using a P3 for large federal capital projects. Should the assessment conclude that there is P3 potential, the procurement department will be required to develop a P3 proposal among the procurement options. Furthermore, the budget also encouraged departments to explore the potential of a P3 approach for other types of procurements. As the center of expertise for the federal government on P3s, P3 Canada will work closely with federal departments and agencies through the screening process and offer our services should they choose to move forward. That would be creating a development plan, undertaking a robust value for money analysis and a risk analysis. P3 Canada has created a P3 screening guide to assist departments, and that's on our website. This was launched in April following the release of Treasury Board Secretariat's guideline to implementing Budget 2011 on the direction of public-private partnerships. Other products and tools continue to be developed. PPP Canada is currently engaged with several departments, including transport on the new bridge across the St. Lawrence. We believe that the increased value and accountability generated by more and better P3 procurements, in addition to the budgetary certainty they provide, will leverage savings for taxpayers far beyond the operations of the organization. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. We'll now start members' questions with Mr. Marston for a 5-minute round.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. And Mr. Clemens, I'm in one of those situations where I agree with you and I disagree with you at the same time. When you talk about old age security and you talked about the fact that that has addressed seniors' poverty, yes, to a marginal degree over time it did. In the days that this was first undertaken is when people were starving to death on the prairies. Now, are you aware of the low-income cutoff? It's about $22,000 a year. Would you accept that as the poverty line, sir? You don't think that's the poverty line?
Well,
okay.
Sorry,
well, that
StatCan itself says it's not a measure of poverty.
What would you call the poverty line? I'll allow that one to you.
Well, I think we could use the MBM from StatCan. We could use Chris Sarlo's number. I mean, I wouldn't use LICO as the poverty line.
Okay. So what I'm searching for here is what you think the poverty line is.
Well, again, I would say we could
just throw out a dollar figure so we got something to talk about here.
Well, no, I mean I can't. Maybe
okay.
Andrew.
Well, let's talk about what seniors get. Seniors get $1,140 a month, and you don't get GIS unless you qualify for OAS. And if you're getting $1,140 a month in Canada, you are definitely below the poverty line. You're definitely living in poverty. Pause and think for a second how far you go with that. Like I spoke to people across this country. I had 40 town hall meetings across this country talking to seniors about what their lives were like and listening to them. And if you go to places like St. Thomas, where a woman spoke to me about the fact that they delisted some medication for her husband. She didn't know where she could find $90 a month. Another lady, when the HST is coming in up in Elliott Lake, was worried about where she could find $161 a year. That's where people are at in this. Now, I can't say as I disagree with you, sir, on potentially looking at where's the cutoff point where people qualify for this and that. But, Mr. Jackson, I'd like to ask you a question, sir, about the implications of the transfer of this money. Like people in ODSP, disability in Ontario, who look to get ahead a little bit, or people on welfare who look to get ahead a little bit at the age of 65 will be at the lower rate, even lower than GIS OAS, for an additional 2 years. But the cost also is passed along. Do you agree?
Well, my understanding, I mean, certainly there's going to be a cost to the provinces for that subgroup of persons aged 65 to 67. I mean, now transition off provincial social assistance programs, other provincial programs, onto OAS, GIS, once they turn 65. So that transition is going to be delayed. I guess on top of that, I mean, there are a layer, particularly of single older workers who also would get quite a significant improvement in their standard of living when they turn age 65 and qualify for the GIS. So I guess just to go back to your earlier question, I mean, actually, I think in terms of the various low-income lines, when you look at the dollar amounts between the market basket measure and the LICO, it doesn't vary all that much. What GIS really does is push the great majority of seniors just above that low-income line, but they simply don't get very far above it. So it's a pretty bare bones.
In fairness to the government, the finance minister has said that he was going to help the provinces and the municipalities with some of this. I don't want to be totally, well, I'll stop there. I was going to say something different. Sir, the OECD pension team evaluated OAS. Parliamentary Budget Officer evaluated OAS. They both said it was sustainable, that it was a modest increase to GDP which was required. What's your opinion of that? You are an economist, I understand.
Well, the figures are there for everybody to look at in the, in the report from the chief actuary, and there's nothing about those figures that should come as a surprise to anybody. So why we suddenly thought it became unsustainable sort of when the Prime Minister went to Davos, I'm not sure, because there were no new facts that had come to light.
Well, it also wasn't mentioned in the election campaign at all by the Prime Minister. How long was that, Mr. Chair? 30 seconds. Well, I'll just stop at this point.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Marston. Go back, please.
Chair, and I thank you witnesses for coming out, and I appreciate the short notice and your accommodating the committee and with the short notice. It's actually been one of those days today where it's been hard to plan anything, and I think the chair must be pulling his hair out trying to schedule meetings and coordinate witnesses, and I appreciate the work the clerk does in regards to that. You know, the testimony here I find really amazing because I come from Saskatchewan, like my colleague in Alberta, and I'll use an example from my riding. I have a local Canadian Tire, and they've been trying to get mechanics. For quite a while. A couple years ago, there was layoffs in the auto sector in Ontario, so he went down to a job fair, did his own job fair in those areas trying to hire people, and the common answer he got, and he was very blunt to me, was, yes, I'll think about it once my EI runs out. But I'm going to wait here for the whole time my EI until my EI runs out, and then maybe I'll give you a call, and maybe then. And that's been quite common talking to different businesses in my area and in Saskatchewan. And because of that, we're missing out on huge opportunities to develop more of our resource sector, more of our logistics sector, and more of the business sector as a whole, and all the spin-off jobs that created from them, which would also create more jobs in Ontario and Quebec because of the activity that's going on out west, which is proven. So I guess I just find it really interesting when I'm trying to figure out what people are trying to say, if we should just let people sit on unemployment insurance when there's a good job there, or if we should just, yeah, there's a good job there, but I'm going to finish off my term with EI, and then maybe that job will still be there, maybe it won't, but that doesn't matter. So there has to be some sort of incentive system to get them back to work, it appears to be. And I think that's what we're doing. I think that's the total goal, is to make sure that we see some productivity out of these folks. And I think actually they want to get back to work if they would ask themselves that question. Now, Mr. Clements, I'm going to go to you first, and then I'm going to come back to what I just talked about, because you wanted to answer the question, I think, that Mr. Marsden asked you when it came to the line of poverty. So I'm going to let you answer that question.
Well, the point I was going to make, I don't disagree with Andrew that there are some differences between the various lines, but those are important ones. But more importantly is to recognize the different effect on different households. So if you have two seniors who are both receiving GIS and OAS, it's a very different circumstance than if you have a single elderly person who's only receiving GIS. And those circumstances should be treated differently. In addition, the data is quite clear that the cost of living varies considerably city to city. So if you're a low-income individual senior in Vancouver on GIS and OAS, it's a very different circumstance than if you're from my hometown of Windsor. Now, the point I was trying to make in my opening comments is I would love to see a discussion about if we curtail OAS, claw it back more aggressively, free up some of those resources to better target GIS, how do we do a better job? And I think one of those I'd be more than open to discussing is to augment the benefit for single individual elderly people. But the reality is, again, given the demographic deficit that we're facing, we've got to use scarce resources better. And as I say, my view is having OAS a full benefit of OAS on the individual level up to $70,000 in income, I just don't think is a well-targeted program.
That's a good point, and that's actually something that I think in our pre-budget talks for next year we should actually be talking about that, and I encourage the chair to consider that when we look for witnesses. Going back to the unemployment insurance, when it comes to creating jobs, this government's been fairly clear, and Mr. Sia, you have to agree, in this budget we're extending the hiring credit for small businesses to encourage over 50,000 small businesses to hire more workers, and receive very popular. Investing in youth employment strategy to assist more young people gain work experience and get into the workforce. Again, $50 million there. Improving economic opportunities for Aboriginal youth, which I think is very important. Increasing opportunities to fund help Canadians with disabilities to get into the job market. Improving the job market information for Canadians looking for work. Assisting older workers who want to keep their skills and keep employers finding them and working. And much more. There's lots of things in this budget. But these things in the budget, they're not east-west. They're right across Canada. Now, I want to make that point. This is shameless when you start saying it's a west favoritism or an east favoritism. That's absolutely shameless, and that plays right into the NDP politics of conquer and divide, or split and divide. So what do you say to that? These are programs that are good right across Canada.
Okay.
So why would you say there's an east-west divide?
Just a brief response, sir.
Certainement, Monsieur le député, moi je vous renverse.
I'd like to put a question to you, sir. Are you aware of the average duration of a person who is receiving employment insurance in Canada? Do you know what the average period of time in which this is received?
Questions are through the chair. The answers are through the chair. So.
D'abord, Monsieur le Président, je m'adresse à
Mr. Chairman, then I'll put the question through the chair then to the member who just asked me a question. I'd like to know what the average duration of an employment insurance benefit in Canada is. The answer to this question is 20 weeks.
Je veux y répondre, bien sûr. C'est pour ça que mon micro est...
Yes, I'd like to answer the question, certainly. The average duration of a benefit, an employment insurance benefit, is 20 weeks, 4 months and a half. The theoretical duration is 36 weeks. According to the rules of admissibility, people can continue to receive employment insurance for a certain part. The average duration is 20 weeks. 60% of claimants do not go to the end of their period. We are not basing this. Do you not wish to hear my answer, sir? I say that 75% of employment insurance claimants when we hear certain prejudices, I think it's important to give the figures.
Thank you very much. Can't we all just get along? Look, I wanted to talk a little bit on the OAS because I actually think there's some common ground between what Mr. Clemens has said and what Mr. Jackson has said, in that I have real concerns. We may disagree on whether or not OAS is sustainable, and there are arguments being put forth. The OECD, the Parliamentary Budget Officer, said that it's sustainable in its current form. It goes from, I think, 2.7% of GDP now to, I think, 3.1% in 2030 and drops down after. But you've raised a good point. If it were not sustainable, there are more progressive ways to address its sustainability. So first of all, I believe it's sustainable, so I don't think we have to make those changes, but it's a good idea to consider what we would do that would be less regressive than the approach being taken. The reality is 40% of the people getting OAS are making less than $20,000. 53% make less than $25,000. It's fine to say you can work a couple extra years if you're a politician or an economist or a journalist or an accountant, but if you're a physical laborer or a woman working in a fish plant in Newfoundland in a cold, damp environment, the extra couple of years from 65 to 67 may be very difficult. So would it not make sense? You suggested addressing this through the clawback approach. Should we, for instance, consider ideas including taking a look at the type of labor, in terms of some type of physical labor? You suggested as well looking at single seniors. Does that not take a more thorough analysis, and is that not one of the arguments why we should be dealing with this as a separate piece of legislation, that we can really devote Parliament's time, efforts, and research to it? Either of you. Oh, either of them.
Mr. Clemens?
Just quickly clarify on the sustainability. The technical or the traditional definition of sustainability is, given current policies, can it be funded without changes over time? And OAS is going from 1 in $5 of spending to 1 in 4. So it either is going to be financed by more taxes or crowding out other spending.
Respectfully, if we differ on that point, I'm trying to get to a
Sure.
point where we may agree.
No,
and that is the...
Sorry, I just wanted to clarify why I was saying it was unsustainable. I would be open to either of those suggestions. I mean, again, part of the point I was trying to make post-budget when the announcement was made and the Prime Minister's announcement in Davos is that there's a lot of moving parts to retirement income. And if we only look at OAS and GIS, we're missing considerable parts around that. And so if we bring up the issue of the single elderly person, then we're definitely talking about GIS. Some of the other programs are moving parts.
May not be at the work to
My concern would be how the technical process through which we're going to make those determinations. Again, I think the easy lifting, so to speak, is to identify the clawback threshold for OAS, ask the question of better targeting, and I think for single individual seniors, I think it's fairly easy to do that since we already differentiate those benefits now.
Jackson, do you think?
Well, I think if you increase the clawback, it would be a less bad way of going about doing things. I guess on the sustainability thing, really, we're phasing in this increase in such a way that it really only applies when the cost of OAS peaks. So it doesn't really make that much difference to the cost of the program. I mean, the average person who starts is going to collect, the average person that's 65 is going to live past 80, so you're cutting off 2 years. It's not a huge percentage point reduction to the cost of the program. But I guess what I would say is I would not ignore the importance of OAS to people who aren't in a very low-income situation. I mean, we know that baby boomers or a significant section of middle-income baby boomers aren't saving enough for retirement as things go. I mean, CPP and OAS in combination replace 40% of the average wage, which is a very low public pension compared to the great majority of OECD countries. So there's a lot of couples there. I mean, they are going to lose, a significant chunk of change, the ones who are fully affected by it. And, I mean, I guess basically they're going to have to work that much more to make up the difference or save that much more. But we know people are sort of having trouble saving. So that's why I'm not sure whether the real motivation of this is for the cost or the view that people are retiring too early. And to my mind, there's all kinds of positive incentives we can put in place for people to continue working past 65 to encourage employers to retain workers. I mean, we could talk about all those things if that's what the debate is about.
Okay, thank you. We're right at 5 minutes, Mr. Bryson. Thank you. We'll go to Mr. Jean, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I've been in Fort McMurray 45 years, and since there's 1,500 people there, and my community is built by people from the rest of Canada, unemployed from mostly Eastern Canada, Newfoundland, Labrador. Actually, they say that Fort McMurray is the second largest Newfoundland city in the world, which I think is probably true. But one thing residents true is exactly what my friend Mr. Hoback says, is that many people come to Fort McMurray to get the maximum amount of weeks. And then they go home, wherever that home may be. And I understand why, because I'd like to be home too right now. But I'm here working because I accepted this job. And I'm just wondering, since it is such a common thing to have people work the minimum amount of works and return to their home, do you think it's reasonable that they do that? And what would be reasonable in the circumstances as far as a minimum number of weeks to have people work to be able to return home? Because the jobs are available, let's face facts. They're there. They're just in a different part of the country.
I really understand the question in there. I mean, presumably they wouldn't qualify for EI unless their employer in Fort McMurray laid them off. I mean, if they're...
I also know that many people ask for layoffs, and I've never heard of anybody refusing it. And if they do refuse it, they go to the EI office and they complain for 15 seconds, and they get their EI. And that's common. And I've worked in the labor unions. I've worked in those areas, and I know that's what happens because I've seen it happen consistently. And I'm just asking you, what would be a reasonable number of weeks for a person to come to Western Canada and work to receive unemployment benefits for the rest of the year? That's my question. What do you think is reasonable?
I'm blocking slightly the question. I mean, I don't object to the current rules. I mean, I think, we haven't said workers
ignoring the current rules, what do you think is reasonable?
So.
What do you think is reasonable in the circumstances? Because you're opposed to these changes. So I'm just asking you, what do you think is reasonable? And it's a simple question.
Okay, one at a time.
It's a simple question. Number of weeks per year.
Okay, let's let the witness answer the question.
I don't think. We accept the status quo that a worker should not be eligible for EI unless they have lost a job through no fault of their own. They have to be sort of laid off by an employer. I mean, as you say, I think that the vast majority of unemployed workers, given those circumstances, will seek another job. As you've alluded, there's huge numbers of workers from rural Atlantic Canada. The high unemployment regions have moved west.
A welder in most part of the country makes $30,000-$40,000 a year. In Fort McMurray, they're making $150,000 to $180,000 a year. That's because there's not enough of them there. What I'm suggesting is clearly the jobs are there. They're all over Alberta. They're all over Saskatchewan. So what is reasonable for a person to be able to come to Western Canada from Quebec or from the Maritimes or Newfoundland and Labrador? What is a reasonable expectation for the government to have for them to work? How many weeks per year to collect unemployment insurance for the rest of the year?
I think a great majority of unemployed workers would like to work 52 weeks a year, like full-time permanent workers. It's not a matter of the government saying 28 weeks.
The jobs are there for 52 weeks a year. I promise you they are. I've been there my whole life. I can promise you they're there. So can you answer the question? You can avoid it if you want. Just tell me you don't want to answer the question. What do you think is reasonable? You're opposed to our changes. So what do you think is reasonable? The jobs are there.
Okay, Mr. Jean, let's let him answer. We have to give him an opportunity to answer the question. Mr. Jackson, we'll give you the opportunity to answer.
I think we're talking past each other. I mean, under the current system, whether you're eligible for EI is going to depend on the local unemployment rate. If you're working in Fort McMurray and you're laid off from your job, you have a much shorter eligibility for EI as if you were working in Corner Brook. I would sort of frankly dispute your assertion that those workers go to EI, collude with employers to have themselves laid off so they can go back to Atlantic Canada. I mean, typically people work very long shifts. When they fly in, they go back home for the off shift. But I mean,
they work very hard, and they pay the taxes for the EI benefits. But some people do, and a lot of my people do, and they support me in my position with the government in relation to C-38 and the changes we're making. A lot of people do. In fact, I haven't found anybody that doesn't that works in Fort McMurray. What I'm suggesting is, how many weeks do you think is reasonable to put in per year? And Mr. Sear, you've avoided the question. So, Mr. Sear, do you have any comments?
J'ai des commentaires. Bien sûr, j'ai des commentaires.
Yes, I do have comments. The bill does not make any changes, sir, to the criteria for eligibility for employment insurance. It does not make any change to the period of benefits. This is not what we're talking about. Once you are on unemployment insurance, you create three types of claimants who will no longer have the same type of entitlements or the same requirements. So those who are referred to as frequent claimants are seasonal workers who happen to be in Eastern Canada. It seems to be a declaration of war. Let me give you one example. In the Saguenay-Lac-Saint-Jean, this is an area in Quebec. In Saguenay-Lac-Saint-Jean, the unemployment area rate was 13 to 14%. At the present time, where the seasonal activity is high, the unemployment rate is 6%. What does that mean? It means that there's been creation of job, or the people are able to work, or the people are not as lazy. Go put the question to people in the Saguenay, and you can watch out when you get your answer. People want to work.
Colleagues, I know members' time is short. I know members have their time, but I just encourage colleagues to pose a question. Let's have a witness answer, and let's allow enough time for the witness to answer within the 5-minute time period. Madame Blanchette-Lamotte, s'il vous plaît, pour 5 minutes.
Merci. Alors,
Thank you. My questions will deal more specifically with old age security, Mr. Jackson. I'd like to put a question to you. I'd like to what you think of the consequences of the change to the old age security program. Who, in your opinion, will be suffering the most as a result of these changes? Because there are people who, as you said, will find it easier to adapt. Can you tell us which segments of society will not be able to adapt as easily and will suffer more from
the industry in Niagara Falls, that a lot of those hotel jobs in the tourism industry have been taken by, industrial workers who lost their jobs in Welland. And, so workers with skills and experience do have an advantage in the job market compared to young people without skills and experience. So to some degree, I think the fact that youth unemployment is so high, reflects the fact that, older workers who lost their jobs did take, to some degree, the jobs that would otherwise be taken as sort of entry-level jobs.
And we're finding now that hundreds of thousands of young people, in fact, are neither in the workforce nor in school. And I think that presents a real challenge for the future, that they're not getting a foothold into the job market. Most Canadians don't have a private pension plan, and they're not able to put money away in RRSPs. And delaying getting OAS for a couple of years not only impacts them to the tune of thousands of dollars, but will also have an impact on their local economy, because people don't have that money in their pocket to be able to go out and buy things for their home or travel or spend money to keep the economy going. Do you have any thoughts about that, about taking this money out of the hands of seniors who could be spending it on the local economy?
I guess my guess would be, if you take people who are sort of 45 to 50 now who see this happening and register that it's happening, I don't think it's going to make a hell of a lot of difference to how much they save. They're not saving very much anyway, that we know. I think that's why we've advocated expansion of the CPP. It takes that element of personal choice out of it to a degree, and it also, of course, requires the employer to contribute to pension saving. So I think, people will just generally say, well, I guess 65 isn't retirement age for me, and I'm probably going to have to work till 70. And I think this is, I think, about changing people's expectations. I think the problem will come when they turn 65, what happens to those who aren't able to continue to work, can't get a decent income.
That's what I'm thinking.
Like
I live in an area with a lot of small businesses, and if people don't have the money to be able to sustain themselves and shop in those local businesses. But let me just ask as a last question to you: do you think it's a surprise to governments and to this government that baby boomers are going to be retiring? Why do you think that the government has suddenly discovered that there's a problem here with OAS when the OECD and others have said that there is no problem? Why now?
Brief response, please.
Well, I'm still in the world of the optimist when it comes to the expansion of the Canada Pension Plan. I think we still have a majority of the provinces prepared to support expansion of the Canada Pension Plan because they do see that looming problem. There are moments when the Minister of Finance seems to have heard that message and be thinking about it. It's still in play, so I think that CPP debate will continue. I frankly see the OAS decision as kind of curiously at odds with that, because, we know people aren't saving enough. We know private pension coverage is shrinking, and, that basic building block of OAS, just to take that away, for a couple of years, I think further undermines the situation.
Thank you, Ms. Nash. Mr. Van Kesteren, please.
Thank you all for coming this afternoon. Mr. Jackson, you're right. There is an alarming rate of young people that are finding difficulty. It's not just in Canada, is it? It's I think I read in Spain it's 25%, 50%. Wow. What do you think? What do you think is the biggest problem? And I'm asking you because I really don't know.
Well, it sounds a bit simplistic, but I just think the reality is that in any economy that has high unemployment, most of the brunt of that is going to fall on people who don't have the skills and experience. Most employers, given a choice, will just hire the person with the skills and experience. I think what you can learn from other countries is that, the overall unemployment is quite low, but youth unemployment is also very low in Germany. And I think part of the reason, if you take Germany, the Netherlands, some other countries, that they really have a very structured way of taking young people out of the educational system into employment through apprenticeship programs. It looks like that. And my impression is German employers, Dutch employers see the socially responsible thing to do to be to continue to maintain the people they're bringing into those programs. So the direct fallout for young people has been much less than here.
I'm sorry. Have you thought about that in the Congress about giving some ideas? And I think you're right. I've heard that about Germany as well too. I think they fast track kids maybe by the ninth grade or something. That the kids know where they're going to go if they have more ability to work in the trades and move them there. And have you thought about that as far as making a recommendation to the government? Because you mentioned something about skills training too, and I agree with you. I think we've got to start to recognize that. But I see a day and an age, and I believe that we're there, where we can't have East and West and labor, and we got to work together. And has Labor thought about maybe a concrete plan that they would come and present to the government as far as where we might avoid the pitfall that's happened in places like Spain?
Well, two quick thoughts. I mean, I guess, first of all, I think one disappointment in the budget when it comes to EI is that we haven't expanded investment in training of unemployed workers through EI. So the government did put in additional resources for that during the recession that's run its course. But, I mean, now's the time. I mean, the argument against spending that money in training is that the payoff hasn't been that big. But, I mean, if we really believe that there are going to be major and growing skill shortages in Canada, then putting that money into training now should have a much significantly bigger payoff than the past. I think what we need to sort of look at, I mean, if there was a targeted intervention, I think it would be around giving young people work experience. So I think sort of summer job terms placements, some sort of incentives to employers to create that experience for young people is where I'd be looking at now. It's, I mean, part of the problem is, I mean, I shouldn't talk about it so much. I mean, what we see in Quebec, I think, with the student protests, I mean, it's the tuition fee, but it's also this view, I think, that a lot of young people are spending more and more time in the educational system because there aren't the job opportunities there for them. And they're not getting much work experience along the way. And I think we really need to sort of marry our educational system more closely with where the jobs are going to emerge and give people some experience in those areas. I might just mention that the CLC is partners with the Canadian manufacturers and exporters on HRSDC, what's called the Roundtable on Workplace Skills, which brings labor employers and government officials together to think about some of these issues. So it's a pretty low-key operation, but, I mean, there are, I think, productive discussions that go on between employers, unions, and the government around some of these workforce issues.
Mr. Clemens, maybe just a few, did you have a few comments in that regard as well, too, about future training?
Well, I mean, one problem I think we observe in many industrialized countries, for one reason or another, we've created this ethos that if you don't go to university, you're a failure. And so, I mean, even if you look at the past 20 years in terms of government expenditures, it tends to be allocated towards the university. Where, I mean, I can tell you there's a whole set of trades that are not going to be replaced by a robot. And so part of it is just leadership of changing that ethos that it is an honorable task and job to be a plumber or a carpenter and a whole set of tasks that are largely at the community college level, if not exclusively at the community college level. So I think now again, I would leave this to the provinces to be respectful to sort out, but I think some general leadership about the fact that, you know, not everybody has to be an economist or a doctor or a lawyer or what have you, that, you know, it is equally acceptable to go to college or to apprenticeship programs. I think the key, though, where I think Andrew and I agree completely is we've got to ensure kids finish grade 12 and that they don't see that as the finish line, that they say, okay, I need another 2 years in apprenticeship. And again, I think much of that should get sorted out at the provincial level.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Van Kesteren. Mr. Caron, s'il vous plaît.
Merci beaucoup. Mes collègues ont passé.
Thank you. My colleagues talked a lot about old age security. I intend to spend more on employment insurance. This is a particular concern in my constituency in eastern Quebec. The first question for Mr. Sarret, because you are familiar with the reality as well. The announce of this reform that was made on Thursday morning Thursday afternoon, I talked with a lot of people in my constituency. I had a number of public meetings on issues relating to C-38, and what surprised me is that I had a number of employers, more employers came to see me than workers, about the problems that would result from the proposed changes, reform in the tourism sectors, for example. People who are working as cabinet makers, for example, are saying that it's very difficult for them because we train our workers for specific type of works in the tourism sector, for example, or as cabinet makers. We have to lay them off for 2 or 3 months because it's seasonal work. But I can hire them again, and I would be able to make use of their expertise. But we are likely to lose some of these people because of the reforms being proposed. So I'd like to know what your impression would be in relation to this, because I've heard there are many employers and employees, and employers in a region such as mine, and I'm sure that this is the case in other areas of. What we've been seeing since the last Thursday in Quebec, the reaction seems to be quite unanimous. A reference was made to the media, all the editorialists and all the newspapers, as well as employers. We've heard from them. The chief economist of the Quebec Employers Association declared that they are going far too far. This is not what we want. We are quite open-minded on the matter. I would say that in 2010, less than 2 years ago, in Montreal, there was a big meeting with representatives of employer organizations at the highest level, the chairman of the Employers Association, the Canadian Federation of Independent Businesses, the Quebec Manufacturers Association, as well as the main representatives of the unions, to talk about the employment system. We devoted a whole day to this in the month of August, and there was a consensus at the time, both on the employer and employee side. They were unanimous that for the time being, they are making use of the employment insurance system for all sorts of purposes that have nothing to do with it, with the money that is being paid by the employers and employees, and the employers say that in Ottawa they are not listening to what we have to say. And this is what the reaction in Quebec is unanimous against these proposals made by the government. Do I have time for any other questions? There are lots of remarks to the effect that these proposed reforms. I'll put the question to the three of you. This will have a downward effect on wages. Do you agree with this, Mr. Savay, Mr. Jackson, and Mr. Clemens? Yes, certainly. Take, for example, the carpenters who are working for $20 an hour. He may be a temporary construction worker, and he finds himself unemployed. The first week of employment, he's going to have to accept a job at 80%, and then later on at 70% of his wage. Any employer can offer him the same type of carpentry job at $14 an hour. And if he refuses, then he loses his benefits. Mr. Clemens, would you agree that this would have a downward effect on wages, lowering of wages?
EI. Sorry, I didn't prep for EI. Sorry.
Okay. Mr. Jackson?
Well, yeah, no, I mean, I'm somewhat torn on how to respond to this, because I think that actually the reality right now is that what workers do, for the most part, sort of as the end of a claim nears, workers do accept jobs at lower wages. So I'd like to know what evidence there is that workers are, under the current situation, turning down, suitable job offers. I mean, I think it's hugely exaggerated. And certainly we saw that in Ontario through the recession. I mean, workers did accept jobs at much lower wages, especially older workers, than used to be the case. So I think it's very exaggerated, this idea that unemployed workers are sticking around with, but if it's going to make any difference at all, it is going to push down wages for some, I mean, especially in the high unemployment regions.
Rapidement, je posais la question parce que dans ma circonscription.
I put this question. Unfortunately, your time is up.
Ms. McLeod, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I too would like to thank the witnesses. I think I have two quick comments and then a question. Certainly, I've looked at people who have argued for or against the sustainability of OAS, and intuitively, I'm not an economist, but given the numbers that I've seen and heard, really, I do believe we have a significant issue, and the government has had to make a very difficult decision in terms of moving forward on that issue. I thought Mr. Clemens' comments were very interesting in terms of some opportunity in the future that we might have in terms of how we look at that piece. Although I thought as an individual, if I was having my OAS clawed back, which wouldn't be popular, but I would almost say, is there bigger safety net holes for children than there is for seniors? So I think that's a completely complex and different discussion that we have. In terms of EI, again, I don't think anyone here can disagree with the fact that for people on EI to get regular notices in terms of opportunity that's above and beyond the job bank, anyone would argue with that. I don't think, if you would maybe put up your hand and we can engage in that debate, I don't think anyone would argue with Canadians really knowing what opportunities there are around the temporary foreign worker program. And I think, again, what we have a debate on is what is reasonable, again, in certainly the government's opinion, in terms of some very modest reforms in terms of not relocating people into different communities, not looking at people, taking dramatically difference, but just providing those supports so that they can move forward. So, certainly, I don't think it's as dramatic as perhaps it's been indicated. But so having said that, those are my sort of two pieces that I wanted to talk about. I do notice that Mr. Clemens has some expertise in healthcare, and I know it wasn't what you prepared for today, but I do want to quickly touch on it because I think it's important to all Canadians. I had the opportunity in the mid-2000s to do a lot of work around international comparisons, and I went into this my process, very proud of Canada and our system, and thinking I would leave my process saying, we're the best in the world. I was quite quickly dismayed in terms of what we were doing and where we were going, especially in terms of outcomes for expenditures. So, as a government, you probably noticed that we make significant commitments in terms of increases to 2016-17. We believe that there's many opportunities, and I think many countries have shown us that there are opportunities within our current expenditure. So maybe would you like to talk about your sort of perspective on this area?
So I think the framework for reforming health care is the Liberal reforms of 95, 96 on welfare. The Liberal government essentially removed most of the national standards, cut the block grant, but gave the provinces significantly more freedom to experiment and innovate and learn from one another. I think that general framework is, to some extent, the path we're on, although I do think there are still significant federal impediments to experimentation and innovation based on successful models in OECD countries that provide universal health care. I spent 3.5 years in the United States, and it is not a model that we should replicate, although there are some lessons we can learn. I think we should be looking to countries like France, Germany, Switzerland, Sweden, Australia, to some extent Japan. And what I would hope is that we can have a conversation on making a universal, portable Canadian system that is the best on the planet by learning the lessons from those countries as to how they deliver universal, portable health care. I think the next step for the federal government, which is a very difficult one, is going to have to be a discussion about the Canada Health Act and how aspects of the Canada Health Act prevent reforms that we see in other OECD countries that have universal health care. I mean, I don't underestimate how difficult that conversation is because, for one reason or another, most Canadians have a false dichotomy in their head that we either have the status quo or we have the American system. And the reality is there are a number of lessons that we can learn from other countries that have universal systems where we could improve healthcare dramatically within the current envelope of spending. That would be the general framework that I'd suggest. There are obviously more specifics if you'd like.
Out of time here, so thank you, Ms. McLeod. Ms. Glover, please.
Thank
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Welcome to all the witnesses. I'm going to ask a couple of questions. First of all, I'm going to ask about the rate-setting mechanism in the EI section. And I'm also going to ask Mr. Smith about the P3 project. So let's start with Mr. Jackson, if we could. What do you think of the EI rate-setting mechanism changes?
Well, I guess as you recall, our preference was well, what we'd like to see is basically the government, so the premium payers pay for the cost of the program, what I'd describe as a normal rate of unemployment, which would be about 6%, the cost of regular benefits, and then the government to pick up the cost of recessions. I mean, by effectively, by capping...
Do you know what it is?
Sorry?
You know what it is?
I know what it is.
Right.
It's going up at 5
we've
cents.
had a conversation about it before. No, about the mechanism. Not about the premium, but the mechanism.
Remind me, because...
Okay, well, the mechanism is, we've said that what we're going to do is we're going to allow for it to be set annually, and then once we return to balance, we're going to look at the 7-year historical data, which was almost unanimous by all those, including yourself, who partook in the EI report consultations. So we've actually followed the advice about doing the historical stuff. So I ask you again, what do you think of the mechanism?
Oh, and I refresh my memory and reread it. It always seems so far off that we get to that point that I could...
Okay.
We're going to be at least 5 or 6 years before we return to balance, I believe.
Well, no, because you spend so much time talking about the EI stuff, I thought you'd looked at the other stuff, because this is a really big book, and there's only 2 sections that have been talked about, and the whole section on EI hasn't been talked about, but it surprises me that you aren't aware of that very important issue. But nevertheless, I'm going to turn to Mr. Smith, because I come from the city of Winnipeg, where the Chief Peguis Trail was a tremendously successful project that was run through PPP Canada. And I just want to read a couple of quotes for the benefit of my colleagues from some city officials with regards to this project, because the project was on budget and finished a year early. Here's what City Councillor Jeff Brawadi said. He said, quote, "It's quite miraculous. I think it's a lot to do with the innovation of it being a P3 Canada Fund project." Here's what Mayor Sam Cates had to say, and I quote, "It's a pretty phenomenal performance. I think that that just goes to show how in certain situations a P3 is the ideal approach to take on projects. We're very happy with the result." Having said that, there are some changes in this budget that are about to come about. I want you to explain for us, Mr. Smith, how the amendment in today's Act will actually better allow P3 Canada to interact with federal departments to provide expertise on public-private partnerships, if you wouldn't mind.
Thank you. Yes, the Chief Peguis project was very successful, and we're proud to be a part of that. What this the Bill C-38 does, it will allow us to take the expertise that we've learned from implementing the P3 Canada Fund and allow us to enter into very formal, direct relationships with federal departments and agencies in terms of providing our advisory services and passing on to them our knowledge and expertise that we've learned along the way and over the past 3 years. That's what it'll do for us.
So if I take the project, the Chief Peguis project, can you just explain for us how the changes, like how did it work before these changes, and how will it work once these changes are made? Can you just kind of show us, verbalize for us how it'll look that's different?
I think I'd respond first by saying that there is a well-established best practice with respect to implementing a P3 project, all the way from doing a needs assessment for the asset, then working your way through a procurement options analysis where you will, in fact, look at whether the P3 option is better than a traditional procurement. If that is still generating value for money, you then go into the procurement process through an RFQ, qualifying usually 3 proponents to bid on it. You move into an RFP process, which ultimately culminates with you choosing a preferred proponent with whom you enter into a long-term contractual arrangement. So that process would operate the same with on a federal project as it would for the fund that we provide funds to provinces, municipalities, and First Nations. So that would be the same. What this does, though, is it brings us into the federal family. As a Crown Corporation in the federal business, we are kind of outside of the federal family. By being an agent of the Crown, we're able to share confidential information and provide that very frank advice with departments that they're looking for when they're doing their business planning process.
Ms. Glover, we have a couple minutes left. I just wanted to follow up as chair on some of the comments by Mr. Clemens with respect to the changes to OAS. And you talked about how OAS will interact with the RIF guidelines. You also talked about looking at the marginal rate of taxation. As you know, we've changed, or we've moved the age from 69 to 71. Some witnesses who appeared before the committee on previous issues have said we ought to look at moving it up more. Others have said we ought to look at the mandatory withdrawal amount. So I wanted you to perhaps address that question first, and then I have a second question on marginal rates of taxation. In terms of your preference or any advice you'd have.
Well, the thing I would stress most on the RIF is a flexible framework. So whether that is dealing with the mandatory minimums to be withdrawn or the age, as I say, my preference would be that it's a flexible framework so that it recognizes different people in different circumstances. But clearly, the implication is that the age would be increased. If we're going 65 to 67, it seems to me we should be looking at 73. Again, I think the move from
looking at 73 for the RIF.
For the RIF, that's right. Yeah, and I would also include in that the mandatory amount that's withdrawn on a regular basis. But again, I mean, the larger concern I have is how OAS and GIS interact with both the private, public, and provincial plans, programs, and regulations.
To what extent? Can you expand on that for me then?
Well, certainly. So if we talk, for example, on the private pension, much of the legislation is at the provincial level. And so we then need to understand what changes are going to be made at the provincial level so that they're congruous with what's being made at the federal level so that there is, to the greatest extent possible, harmony between the regulations at the different levels. And this plays in to some extent with benefit programs and the marginal tax rate comment that I made.
And on the marginal tax rate, then we have obviously the four brackets. There's a sizable jump from the 15% rate to the 22% rate. Is that, when you're talking about marginal rates, is that where you're focusing most of your attention?
No, well, in fact, I think the key consideration is the scaling back of benefits. So the marginal effect, I think, is much more on if I get an extra dollar of income, am I putting in jeopardy benefits? And again, given the interaction of if you have a pension that you're now having to take income out of while you're working, the disincentive for work, depending on your marginal tax, the marginal effective rate, could be such that there's just a disincentive for you to work, which is why I think the coordination is key.
So just so I understand correctly, so you're saying if someone is collecting OAS, and then they say return to work, and then they collect more. So then their OAS gets clawed back, so they say at the end of the day, I'm not sure why I'm returning to the workforce because there's no benefit.
Well, and I think, Mr. Chair, that one of the key things we didn't talk about was the deferral program for OAS, which I know Jack Mintz at University of Calgary is a champion of, and I think he's on the right track because it does, again, give the individual or the household a great degree of flexibility for that period of time when they can defer OAS and then work without risk of losing an OAS benefit and then get a higher benefit over a shorter time period. I mean, I think those types of mechanisms that allow for more flexibility in decision by individuals and households is critical. Particularly, again, as you know, some of the discussion today has, I think, in an implicit way assumed the changes are today. The changes are a decade and a half, 2 decades down the road, and to assume that our economy today is going to look what it looks like, or is going to look in 2 decades like what it does today, I think is challenging to say the least.
Okay, and I did want to finish up because I think it is a fair question to say what is the rationale for the government acting with respect to OAS, and I'll just read a quote here. The major demographic transition that is underway in Canada will strain government's finances over the next several decades. During this time, population age will move an increasing share of the population out of their prime working age years and into their retirement years. This will put downward pressure on revenues as growth in economic activity, and therefore the tax base slows. At the same time, aging will put upward pressure on programs whose benefits are entirely or disproportionately realized by Canadians in older age groups, such as elderly benefits and health care, and that's from the Fiscal Sustainability Report 2011 of the Parliamentary Budget Officer. So, I mean, I don't have much time left, Mr. Jackson, Mr. Clemens, but I mean, it seems to me is a very strong rationale in terms of why the federal government needed to act with respect to health care transfers and with respect to the OAS. So I don't know if you have any comment on that, but
well, again, I think if we're talking about health care reform, I think the model is the 95-96 reforms by the Liberal government. I think the current government has taken steps in that direction. I think the key, though, now is on the regulation through the Canada Health Act on what the provinces can actually do. On OAS, as I've said, by the actuary's own data, it's going to go from $1 in $5 of federal spending to 1 in 4. So as a simple mathematical identity, it means other spending has to be cut to accommodate that spending in the current tax or revenue envelope, or additional revenues have to be raised. And so that, to me, is the question of sustainability. And again, I do think taking a forward step this far in advance of the problem is an excellent first step. I just think there are additional steps that the government should consider.
Okay. Well, I appreciate that, and I want to thank you, and I want to thank all of our witnesses for their time today. And if they have anything further to submit to the committee, please do so. We'll ensure all members get it. Colleagues, we have another panel coming forward, but I will suspend for a couple of minutes and allow them to come forward. Thank you. I call this meeting back to order, and I want to thank our guests for coming in this evening. We have, and I'll list them in the order that they'll be presenting. I have Mr. Paul Kennedy. I have Ms. Jane Lunderville. I have two officials from the Department of Justice, Mr. Michael Ziger, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. We have Ms. Sophie Beecher. They can certainly come forward to the table. Oh, okay. Is Mr. Ziger here? Okay. For public safety, we have Mr. Stephen Bolton. From the RCMP, we have Mr. Joe Oliver. And from the Windsor Police Service, we have Mr. Jerome Brannigan. So you'll each have up to 5 minutes for an opening statement, and then we'll have questions from all the members. And we'll begin with Mr. Kennedy, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I'm going to be speaking to the issue of the elimination of the Office of the Inspector General. The protection of national security against threats is of the highest priority, and the men and women who dedicate their professional lives to this task deserve our sincere thanks. At the same time, we must acknowledge that the presence of a domestic intelligence agency that covertly investigates persons within Canada, including Canadian citizens, for activities that are not necessarily unlawful but are suspected of being threats to the security of Canada is on its face inconsistent with democratic values. Due to their covert nature, security intelligence activities do not lend themselves to a traditional accountability model. While all government institutions are subject to the Access to Information and Privacy Acts, which acts allow individuals to access personal information which individual departments or agencies may have collected, any such request to CSIS would elicit a neither confirm nor deny response. This normally unacceptable practice or situation is currently accepted in Canada because we collectively recognize that Canada faces security threats that must be investigated if we are to preserve our democracy, that traditional accountability models would compromise the intelligence agency's ability to protect us against threats, and that following the FLQ crises, both the work of the Royal Commission of Inquiry headed by Justice MacDonald and in-depth deliberations by a joint committee of the House and Senate headed by Senator Pitfield resulted in the crafting of a thoughtful oversight review regime which forged an acceptable balance between the realities of intelligence work and the imperatives of a democracy. That regime, in addition to the creation of CERC, placed the Minister of Public Safety in a very direct line of accountability for the investigative activities of CSIS. The Minister's personal approval is required for every court application to intercept communications and to conduct searches. That isn't just a general authority. He has to look at it and approve it. The Minister may direct whom the service may or may not investigate. By way of contrast, the Minister's resignation would be demanded were the Minister to seek to exercise such a role in regards to the actions of the RCMP. Inappropriate behavior by CSIS falls at the feet of the Minister. He cannot distance himself from their actions as he would with the RCMP. The Minister of Public Safety presides over a vast portfolio which engages the services of some 40,000 public servants. It is impossible for him to know whether each individual is conducting his or her responsibilities in accordance with the law, operational policies, and ministerial directives, and whether powers are being exercised in a reasonable manner. It is for this very reason that we have the Office of the Inspector General. That office audits the investigative activities of CSIS at the case file level to ensure that it, in fact, is complying. The Inspector General reports directly to the Minister and provides assurance that matters are on course or provides a heads-up as to potential problems. When one considers the personal accountability assigned to the Minister by Parliament, one can understand the need to provide the Minister with a set of independent and professional eyes and ears that will permit him to fulfill his role properly. Without such an office, the Minister would be blind and entirely at the mercy of the intelligence service. This is not either reasonable or a desirable outcome. Both the RCMP Security Service and CSIS have had more than their fair share of troubles. Edmund Burke once said, "Those who don't know their history are destined to repeat it." The financial costs of past missteps in the area of national security,
1 minute, Mr. Kennedy.
measured simply in terms of commissions of inquiry, cost tens of millions of dollars. And that's not counting the loss of public support. There can be no acceptable excuse for failure to detect mistakes. I know that you're worried about costs, and this is a cost exercise. Costs associated with the Office of the Inspector General is a small price to pay if one wants to maintain a covert intelligence agency in Canada. If you choose to eliminate this particular office, I'd recommend that you accompany it with the following common recommendation: that future missteps by the Intelligence Service will be accompanied by the resignation of the Minister of Public Safety. Willful blindness as to potential problems at CSIS must carry a price. After all, as I point out, all responsibility ultimately rests with the Minister.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kennedy. We'll now hear from Ms. Lunderville, please.
I appreciate the opportunity to appear before this committee regarding Section 11 of the Budget Bill. I've been a professor of real estate at the University of Guelph since 1993, teaching and doing research in the area of housing mortgage finance, among other interests. I've written several articles about the mortgage finance system in Canada for the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, and they're available on their website. Canada can be justly proud of our mortgage finance system. Careful underwriting and legislation has allowed us to weather the global financial crisis better than almost any other country. And while the system is strong, improvements can be made. The legislation regulating covered bonds in Section 11 is important. Many European investors are not permitted to invest in covered bonds in countries where there is no legislation. So this will help the banks market these securities, bringing more money into the mortgage finance system. On the other hand, the legislation, financial institutions are prevented from using insured mortgages collateral in these, and that will have the opposite effect. Investors do prefer secure insured loans in an investment pool. So this does reduce the demand for mortgage insurance, which was the goal of restricting that, particularly that purchased by banks on loans that don't need to be insured. So overall, I think it is a sensible measure. The legislation recognizes a major shift in CMHC's focus over the years. Mortgage insurance and securitization compose a large and growing portion of the corporation's activities relative to those related to social housing. Private mortgage insurers are overseen by the Office of the Superintendent of Financial Institutions, and this moves CMHC into that realm as well. I don't anticipate that the annual reviews by OSFI will raise any alarms. CMHC has been very prudent in their management of their mortgage insurance portfolio and holds twice the reserves recommended by OSFI. The legislation also places a Deputy Minister of Finance and Deputy Minister of Human Resources and Skills Development Canada as ex officio members of the board of CMHC. It's critical that in an effort to properly oversee the commercial activities undertaken by CMHC, we do not forget their vital role in housing policy and the provision of affordable housing for lower income households and individuals in Canada. The legislation also requires that CMHC make available to the public the books, records, and information that are required by legislation. It is not yet clear what will be required under this, but I look forward to greater transparency of information from CMHC along the lines of what private mortgage insurers are required to provide. Despite the positive aspects of the proposed legislation, I have a couple remaining concerns. As a Crown Corporation, CMHC mortgage insurance policies are implicitly 100% guaranteed by the federal government under the Basel Accord. And as a result, CMHC-insured mortgages require no capital reserves by financial institutions. The protection limit for private mortgage insurance companies is only 90%. As a consequence, the banks whose loans are insured through a private firm must set aside some capital reserves against the possibility of default by the insurer, which is not a requirement for CMHC loans. Thus, rates of return are higher on CMHC-backed mortgages, and when profit margins are thin and banks are nervous about capital reserves, as in the financial crisis beginning in 2008, that made a major difference. CMHC argues that the difference in guarantee is necessary because of their social mandate and the fact that they insure multi-unit residential buildings. In their latest annual report, they state 46.5% of our total rental and high-ratio business addresses gaps in the marketplace left by private sector competitors. This is where more public access to CMHC data would be helpful. CMHC has a monopoly on the provision of insurance of loans for multifamily buildings, including nursing and retirement homes. If the private sector is not permitted to compete in this area, it does not make sense to include these loans in any comparison with them. There's no indication that CMHC does not make a profit on the provision of this insurance. An objective, thorough analysis of the geographic location of privately insured loans relative to CMHC is necessary to back that statement up, and I'd be surprised if there's any material difference. The lender, not the borrower, decides who will insure a mortgage loan, CMHC or a private insurer. And so this is not a competitive marketplace with consumers freely choosing which company will insure their loan, even though they're the ones who pay the large upfront fee. CMHC currently has 70% of the market, and one party with such a dominant share, to me, implies inadequate competition. To conclude, I welcome the introduction of this legislation. I believe that through leveling the playing field for private and public mortgage insurers by giving the same guarantee, consumers will benefit. And there will be more private insurers competing for their business, ensuring competitive fees and greater incentives for product innovation. Thank you.
Very much for your presentation. Just wondering, does the Department of Justice have an opening statement you wish to make?
Mr. Chair, no, we don't.
Okay, well, you'll be responding to questions. And we have had Mr. Bolton and Mr. Oliver before, so I don't know if you wish to add to that statement before, or you'll be available for questions. And then I do have a statement from Deputy Chief Brannigan. Please welcome to the committee and begin your opening statement.
Thank you, sir. Windsor, Ontario is home to 200,000 citizens and welcomes thousands of visitors daily through the Windsor-Detroit Tunnel, the Ambassador Bridge, and by way of boat across the Detroit River. The river is 1 kilometer wide, separating the great countries of Canada and the United States of America. It stretches about 22 kilometers along the Windsor border. The mission of the Windsor Police Service is to prevent and investigate crime, to provide support, and to enforce the law in partnership with the community. We take our mission duties very seriously. Probably the most important component of our mission is partnerships. The relationships we have developed over many years within our regional community and law enforcement partners. These law enforcement partnerships encompass municipal agencies along with provincial, state, and federal law enforcement groups on both sides of the border. We all require the support of each other to keep our cities and regions safe and secure. The Detroit River plays host to almost 500,000 recreational boats from both Canada and the United States during the warmer months. Close to almost 5,000 commercial or ocean-going ships will dock in Windsor or Detroit or pass through between Canada and the United States along this section of the Detroit River yearly. It is an extremely busy waterway. The Windsor Police Service's main responsibility is to the citizens of Windsor. That being said, we accept our role as first responders to any police-related matter that occurs in our city or region. This includes the Detroit River. Sometimes these issues may have a more direct impact on provincial or national interests. Certainly, the link to Canada along the NAFTA highway from Mexico through the United States and across the Ambassador Bridge into Windsor would be one such example. As first responders, the Windsor Police Service is familiar with many issues surrounding the policing of the Ambassador Bridge. It also holds true for the policing of the waterways as between Detroit and Windsor. Police partnerships in my region have grown exponentially into incredible, trusting, focused relationships, all with the same goal, which is to protect and serve our citizens. We have found ways to fight cross-border crime from formerly informal ways to working things out to a more standardized, official, and most importantly, authorized by law manner of policing. Windsor Police has been a member of BEST, the Border Enforcement Security Task Force, since 2009. A Windsor police officer works with numerous multi-jurisdictional law enforcement agencies from Ontario and the United States in an office in Detroit, Michigan. Creation of this BEST unit allows my police agency to acquire real-time intelligence information from the United States. We can then act on that information or disseminate it accordingly. Thanks to Title 19 training, my officer has all the authorities of a United States Customs officer and is authorized by the United States law to carry a firearm in the United States of America. We have had numerous cross-border investigations end successfully in both Ontario and the United States. For many years, criminals have taken advantage of the failure of law enforcement to cooperate in cross-border investigations. Illegal commodities such as firearms, drugs, and human smuggling have flourished through cross-border transport. We need to continue to cooperate in the sensitive style of police work to make it that much more difficult for organized criminals to exploit our cross-border law enforcement weaknesses. Shiprider is certainly a valued, enhanced threat to organized cross-border crime. The Windsor Police Service believes in and embraces Shiprider's value, and we welcome the partnership it creates between Canada and the United States of America. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir, for your presentation. We'll start with Ms. Nash for members' questions.
Thank you very much, and welcome to the witnesses. I'll start with you, Mr. Kennedy, on CSIS, and I have to just start by saying where we're dealing with such a large piece of legislation and so many topics, and this evening we're dealing with EI, pensions, public-private partnerships, CSIS, CMHC, and cross-border law enforcement. So it's a many-splendored topics that we're dealing with. When we had government officials here last week, I think it was, they said to us that the rationale for removing the Inspector General from oversight on CSIS was that it was a duplication, and that CIRC could just as easily provide that same service, that it was the same oversight, even though right now, as I understand it, the chair of CIRC is vacant, but that this is just a duplication. From your comments, it sounds like you would not agree with that analysis. Can you explain why?
I'd recommend, and by the way, I'm surprised I don't see more cans of Red Bull out here. A testament to your endurance. I got a headache just listening to parts of the last panel. I've got 20 years in the national security area, and it's an area that's very fraught with challenges. And it's one where you have to have a healthy regard that someone is watching you. Because everything's covert, everything's secret. You think you're getting away with things, but the reality is, I tell people, there's no such thing as a secret. And it's useful for politicians to remember this too, especially if you're in government. They're tiny time capsules. And those things blow up in your face after a day or after a year, 5 years or 10 years. But if there's anything wrong, it comes out. If you actually look at the the report that was released by the Inspector General in May of this year, she goes back over a period of time, and it certainly is written as a farewell piece, and you'll see her articulate there some of the reasons as to what she does and what's unique in terms of the work that the Inspector General does. But one of the key things that is there is CIRC is largely a reactive body. They deal with high strategic issues, and they deal with public complaints, whereas and they can be asked, and if they choose to, they can do something the minister asks them to do. The IG is there designed to serve the minister. The minister can say, you do it for me because your job is to tell me. It's not to go out and tell the public. And what you do, you control the service's activities by operational policies and ministerial directives, plus obviously the law. Because those come from mistakes that have been made in the past 28 years. And I was their general counsel. I know, I was there for a lot of the mistakes. I didn't necessarily make them, but how you fix them. And you control your IOs by developing policies. What they have is a unique power that you'll see that the IG has, is the ability to monitor. You don't see that kind of language used for the CIRC, which does reviews, post-facto reviews. So they can actually go in, this is the IG, and monitor active investigative files to see how are you doing this and have you complied with those policies, and what kind of a performance are you getting. When I looked at it, I didn't see, in terms of power, anyone giving CIRC the power to monitor. Matter of fact, I didn't see anyone transferring the files from the IG over to CIRC for them to do anything. I don't know what's going to happen to them. Usually legislation would provide for some transition. Does that mean they just sit there and 28 years of work dies? There's no money that's been transferred, so the $1 million disappears. No personnel is being transferred, therefore no expertise. So you've got someone who's got some of the same things, but not the same powers. I think And if you look at what they do, they get down into the nitty-gritty, and they'll tell you, you've got problems with your computer system, you're not tracking the data, you're not tracking to whom or with whom you're sharing your data. There's all sorts of stuff that they do that's not otherwise being done.
Really helpful points you're making, and I just have such a short time left. I have 30 seconds. We have such a short time. Do you think that the outcome of this, which is being presented as a cost-saving measure, could actually lead to a repetition of some of the old problems that Canada used to have with the RCMP years back when we didn't have this kind of oversight?
I mentioned that it was born out of crises. I was there when going through a whole series of crises. It's impossible for an intelligence service to define or defend its position in the public because it say, I can't tell you what it is, it's classified information. It requires, on the goodwill of the people, that there are vigorous regimes there that would have detected it, and to have someone else speak on their behalf, assure the minister or the circus or the public. When you don't have that, you end up with public inquiries. All the RCMP, pretty well, who went through the bad days where members were charged with criminal offenses for the activities during the Quebec crisis are gone. It's pretty well civilians there now that have never had that experience. You're going to find them creating new mistakes.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Nash. We'll go to Ms. Glover, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I welcome the witnesses. I'm a little surprised at Mr. Kennedy's statements, given the officials who are here, including public safety and whatnot, who presented on this topic. In fact, many of the things that were outlined to us as parliamentarians were not, in effect, what has been suggested by Mr. Kennedy. Mr. Kennedy, were you able to watch the proceedings of the officials?
No, I was happily enjoying my retirement until I saw this bill.
Well, then perhaps we ought to explain to you, for your benefit, the fact that many of the things that you've suggested are actually wrong. So I would suggest that you might want to actually review what the officials have said, because they made it very clear that many of the things that you mentioned would actually be transferred. But nevertheless, I want to take an opportunity to ask some questions about the integrated cross-border law enforcement suggestion. Now, we have before us a change to the Act that I think will allay some of the myths surrounding our national sovereignty issues. There's been lots of different people say, that there are sovereignty concerns, and I want to give our representatives an opportunity to allay some of those myths, because I think that there are steps in the bill that might do that. So I want to open this up to you so that you can address those myths, please. Justice or public safety, or whoever wants it.
Yeah.
Sure.
Thank you for the question. It is an interesting question, actually, and it's one that we've discussed and thought about quite a bit. I think to start off with when you look at integrated cross-border maritime law enforcement, it does actually have work as a sort of a multiplier effect in terms of your resources at the border, in terms of increasing your coordination among law enforcement at the border. And in general, what that does is it allows you to address cross-border criminality at the border more effectively than you were before. So by doing that, in effect, you are asserting your sovereignty by dealing with threats and addressing issues of cross-border criminality at your border, protecting Canadians and protecting Canadian communities. So in that way, it actually, as a model, it is quite effective. Looking at the bill itself actually does take certain precautions to ensure and safeguard Canadian sovereignty, including enshrining in the legislation the fact that if you had a U.S. law enforcement officer working in Canada, that law enforcement officer would be working under the control of a Canadian law enforcement officer under the host country and would be enforcing the laws of Canada. And following the rules and procedures and policies of Canadian law enforcement. So that in itself, I think, is a way of ensuring or asserting sovereignty by maximizing those leverages, those resources. I'll turn it to Michael.
Just to say that this legislation implements a treaty that we've signed with the Americans, and the treaty itself contains a recognition of the importance and the principle of sovereignty of states. That is incorporated in the statement of principles that's found in the bill itself. I believe it's article or section 4 of the bill contains a statement of principles. Just to follow up on something that Stephen said a moment ago, and that is we are contributing with the Americans a certain number of resources at the border. By partnering with the Americans, let's say we have 4 vessels. If we'd have 4 vessels, then we'd have that's as much as we'd have in terms of our own law enforcement capability or resources. By partnering with the United States, putting a Mountie and a member of the U.S. Coast Guard together on board one of those vessels and then contributing another 4 vessels, we've effectively doubled the resources that both countries have, and they're all able to patrol both sides of the border. So in that sense, I would suggest that we're actually increasing or enhancing the protection of our sovereignty because we have more enforcement people along the border.
I would agree with you. I only have 20 seconds. I happen to be a police officer on a leave of absence, so I know how important security is, and I appreciate that you've allayed those myths because, unfortunately, sometimes misinformation gets out there. So I appreciate that. I will hopefully get another chance because I have some questions for our uniformed members later, but I appreciate the time restraints. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Go to Mr. Bryson, please.
Mr. Chair, and I thank each of you for joining us today. Mr. Kennedy, you served as Senior Assistant Deputy Minister of Public Safety responsible for national security activities?
That's correct, for about 6.5 years.
And you spent 5 years as Senior Chief Counsel to CSIS?
That's right, I was their Chief Counsel.
And 4 years as Chair of the Commission for Public Complaints against the RCMP?
Yes, also about 4 or 5 years I was the Senior General Counsel at Justice who coordinated all the legal advice between the intelligence agencies.
Yeah. And so you speak to us as an informed expert in these areas. We appreciate your advice. You've indicated this $1 million savings from what is a $7 billion public safety department budget. And you indicate that ultimately we could end up paying a lot more out in the future as accountability is eroded by this. And do you predict that we will see more? No system is foolproof, and there will always be times when something falls through the cracks. But do you believe we will see more outstanding claims, more suits against the government, and ultimately further erosion of public trust in the service?
It's the nature of the beast. I've briefed ministers, 3 ministers who act in the role of either Solicitor General or Minister of Public Safety. And the first thing I tell them is, you are presiding over the Ministry of Bad News. You've got corrections officers who have inmates. You have bordering, in this case, people going back and forth smuggling. You've got police officers with guns on their hips, and you've got spies. The nature of the work, it's not bad people, it's just the nature of the work and the risks that the challenges they have to confront with means that people are going to make mistakes. That's inevitable. And it's even higher with intelligence people because you don't have the same comfort that people have that it's going to go to court and a judge will handle it in court. So it's a more complex environment they're working in with terrorism, both here and abroad. Early detection, there will be problems. The issue is, will you detect it earlier? The last big inquiry we did, ARAR, that probably was about a $30 million venture if you throw in the $10 million that the government paid in compensation. It is, yes, very expensive.
You played a very important role in overseeing the investigation into the taser issue at Vancouver Airport. And at that time, you helped to shine light onto, mistakes that were made and oversights in the process and culpabilities ultimately. And do you see any relationship between the government's decision in 2009 relative to your role and this decision in terms of a general approach to accountability and desire to shine light into onto inconvenient truths, perhaps.
I don't know. I don't think, let's put in this context. We've had recommendations for improvements of oversight flowing out of the O'Connor report. We've had it flowing out of Justice Major in terms of Air India. I looked at the most recent reports from CERC, where they were calling for increased powers. The government put C-38, a different C-38, in place to give additional powers to the Public Complaints Commission vis-a-vis the RCMP for national security matters. It hasn't gone anywhere. And Parliament itself was significantly engaged in what used to be C-10 back in 2005, the Liberals introduced, to give Parliament increased oversight. So what we see is all these people recommending increased oversight. I see nothing happening except the diminution of oversight. So to that extent, it really seems odd.
30 seconds.
We are not at this table, none of us are experts at national security. We're on the Finance Committee. Given the gravity of these changes potentially, should this part of the bill be referred to the Public Safety Committee?
It'd be a wise course of action. Then you could have questions asked, what is CSIS doing now? What is the appropriate model? If we're going to give it to CERC, I'm not saying keep this without something else. I'm just saying conceive of what you think is appropriate today. All I see is a reduction, and to call it a consolidation when I don't see files going over, I don't see personnel going over, I don't see money going over, and I suspect, it's only a suspicion, that CERC is being asked to do the same thing as other government institutions, which is to take a cut. So how one fashions out of that improved efficiency of oversight for the intelligence community is beyond me.
Okay, thank you. Okay, we'll go to Mr. Jean, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Not a lot of questions. I was just curious, Mr. Kennedy. I followed your proposal with interest, and I like the debate in relation to what you brought forward, and certainly I would suggest that you seem to be well versed on the issues. And I would also agree with your concept relating to the necessity of democracy and whether or not some things are necessary relating to that. I'm just wondering if you advised 3 prime ministers. Did you advise Michael Ignatieff?
And I advised 3 ministers.
Sorry, 3 ministers.
Those are the ministers who are responsible for CSIS.
And while the previous leader of the Liberal Party was visiting, did you advise him?
Pardon me?
Michael Ignatieff. Did you ever advise him or talk to him in relation to his position on the same issues? Okay, I was just kind of curious because I had an opportunity to review some of his books, and some of the things he spoke about, in relation to torture and calling the dogs of war and being necessary, seem very similar to your own proposal in relation to your thoughts as far as democracy goes and whether or not you can have a society without, pure democratic society, without the necessity of torture and other things. That was what I took from what you suggested, and I'm curious if I was...
No, I don't have any discussions with Michael Ignatieff. My comments to you are based upon my own 20 years' experience in the business, and the fact that if you are in it, you realize, well, I'll give you an example. If you simply go back and look at the submission made by CSIS to Justice O'Connor in the Arar inquiry, you will see that they talk about the advantages to them of having credible oversight, because they cannot speak for themselves. That is just the reality. Former Commissioner Zaccardelli with the RCMP, who resisted for years any expansion of any powers of review over their activities from the complaint body, came out in a speech to the International Police Association, said, I see the light. We need it. We cannot speak for ourselves. We're perceived to be self-serving. I'm saying this as someone who spent years in the business. I'm saying I want that institution to be protected. I want that institution to have credibility. We need it, but it needs credible oversight. When you do this, you're harming the ability of CSIS to have credibility with the public when there's a problem. And in terms of democracy, Mr. Oswald Destin, he was called in 1986 when a mistake happened at CSIS, and the first director, Ted FINA, had to resign, although they were calling for the resignation of the minister, Mr. Keller, at the time. He said, you have to realize, in a democracy, your intelligence service will only be 85% successful. And they asked him, well, would it be as good as BOSS, which was the South African intelligence service, or a Mossad? And he said, no. In a democracy, it'll be 85% effective, because if it's 100% effective, you don't have a democracy. So it's important that it be there, but it has to be controlled. It's a sword. It protects us, but it's a dangerous sword. It's a dangerous sword, and that's here. We need them, but we need them in a controlled fashion.
Now, do you know where these recommendations came from in relation to these changes that you speak against? Are you familiar with any public safety studies that recommended this particular
I know going back a good 20 years at least, that directors have always said we're the most overwatched body sort of in the world.
So
because, those have been traditional complaints.
But those have been a lot. It's been a consistent complaint for years.
Consistent complaint. And when I was there as their counsel, I attached no weight to it, and I don't attach any weight to it now. Because if you're in the intelligence business, you should feel uncomfortable, because you have tremendous powers. So a police officer is going to do a wiretap, they get an order for 60 days. When we're at the service, we get them for a year. And we knew them for a year, and they're quite vast.
I was a defense attorney, I understand, and I understand where you're coming from. But to be consistent and to be blunt, this has been an ongoing issue with this service for a long period of time. It's been a constant complaint in relation to their ability to function properly in Canada. That's my understanding.
I can't see how that would affect them. There's probably about 4 or 5 reviewers who would look at files. There is, I have looked at numbers, 2,500, 3,000 employees at CSIS. What has caused them to waste some of their effort is the inquiries that they get themselves caught up with. I'm sure that, first of all, the trial, the Air India trial, with 1 million pages of documentation, was a burden for them, because they have to redact that. When you get caught up in the Arar inquiry, or you get caught up in the Air India inquiry, these things take a lot of effort.
Mr. Caron.
I already put this question to Mr. Oliver. I think that Mr. Bolton, if I remember correctly, we were here 2 weeks ago. The biggest concern that we have in relation to what is being suggested in the legislation, the interoperability of the Canadian-American forces in navigable areas, is the fact that we are the ones who are giving such powers. I believe we are funding them, rather. This, I gather, is already integrated into the RCMP budget. If this legislation is adopted by the government, will not go before the Public Safety Committee, which, in fact, should be the committee studying this measure. A Canadian who finds himself in breach of regulation in a particular situation, for example, let's say in a river close to Windsor, would have to understand that this law was adopted as a result of a budgetary and a fiscal process. And what type of answer could you give to a Canadian who finds himself in this situation?
Thank you for the question. I think if this Canadian found themselves in this situation, I think what is advantageous about this legislation is that if it was on the Canadian side, if there was a police, if there was a law enforcement operation that picked up someone on the Canadian side, it would be under the direction of Canadian law enforcement. So if there were U.S. law enforcement involved, the Canadian citizen would not have to be 100% familiar or aware of the legislation. In fact, that really wouldn't matter, because the operation would be under the control of Canadian police, in effect. And I don't know if, Joe, you wanted to add to that.
With respect to shipwrighter operations, what the intent is to leverage each other's resources to bring greater crime-fighting capability along the Canada-U.S. border. Now, if we had additional resources, all the better, because then we could apply them to enhance the border. But the reality is that in order to use our existing resources to achieve greater outcomes for Canadians and achieve greater security for Canadians, this legislative tool will allow us to do that. And certainly the fact that we can partner with other policing agencies, Canada, U.S., will allow us that flexibility to better secure the border, within existing resources and at reasonable cost to Canadians.
La prochaine question va être pour...
My next question will be for Mr. Bolton. Quickly, I think that you mentioned to Mr. Zigair that we'd be setting up a commitment that exists in the treaty between Canada and the United States. This is not the first time, I imagine, that you are responsible for drafting provisions that would implement a text of this sort. No, this is not the first time. In your experience, then, can you tell me whether the other legal provisions that you have been called upon to draft and that were presented to Parliament, were they normally submitted to the Public Safety Committee or the Finance Committee? I'm talking about your past experience. In the past, I was involved in the implementation of a number of treaties relating to terrorism, and we did go before the Justice Committee at the time. But this was a C-36. My colleague, Mr. Kennedy, was involved in it at the time. But it was never before the Finance Committee. This is the first time, yes. I've been here, and it's a pleasure for me. I'd like to deal with something different now, but I think that I'll wait until there's a matter of health care or the RCMP. I believe that this is another person who will be discussing this with respect to the health care for the RCMP. So I'll turn to another subject. In the budget, but not in the Implementation Act as such, in the budget itself, I gather that there were decisions taken by the government to cut back on the funding for forensic labs at the RCMP. Is that the case?
That's not within my area of responsibility, so I can't speak to those issues.
J'essayais, mais je peux comprendre que ça peut être difficile pour vous.
I can understand that this would be difficult to you, so I'll put it to someone else who I hope will be able to give me the answer. How much time do I have left? It's expired. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to ask Mr. Bolton, there's been a number of parties who have claimed that we're compromising sovereignty by virtue of the integrated border law enforcement. Could you comment on that and reassure those that we won't be compromising any sovereignty?
Yes, and I think it goes back to a little bit the answer that I gave earlier, which is I think by using our resources more effectively, coordinating with our U.S. law enforcement partners more closely, but at the same time ensuring that Canadian law, that the Charter, that privacy rights of Canadians are protected. And I think it goes back to two fundamental principles of the legislation, which is that the law enforcement officials would be under the direction of the host country, and secondly, that they would be enforcing the laws of the host country that they're in. So I think when you think about the legislation in that way, I think that it goes a long way, and it doesn't diminish the sovereignty. In fact, I think it actually, you could argue that it asserts it, because we'll be dealing with cross-border criminality much more effectively. Joe, did you want to?
Just to reinforce a couple of aspects that have already been spoken to by Mr. Zagari and Mr. Bolton. I think the framework agreement is very explicit in terms of the respect for sovereignty and the conditions under which these operations may unfold. The legislation itself is very clear, and this legislation is before Parliament. The other aspects that will help strengthen the questions of sovereignty are the training is very clear that when operations are in Canada, Canadian officers are the lead. Canadian law applies, Canadian rules, Canadian procedures, and so forth. The other aspect is that the bill also sets out a framework through which we will be accountable to an oversight body for operations undertaken in Canada. So all of those elements together, certainly demonstrate that this is, we are respecting Canadian sovereignty. The aspect that we are trying to achieve here is operational flexibility for people that work on the coalface, and that is to allow us to better pursue criminals that take advantage of the border. This is not about ceding sovereignty at all. This is really about exercising greater operational flexibility in a very complex environment.
Thank you. And
I'd actually add one more thing as well, because one thing I don't think we have mentioned is in terms of the designation of the officials, in that the host country would also have basically the choice of which partners from the visiting country would be part of the program. So it's not like the visiting country, the other country would be able to say, we're going to put these people into the program. The host country, through the central authority, which would be the RCMP, would have the ability to select the officials from the other country, and in the same, the U.S. in terms of Canadian law enforcement. So I think that's an important and helpful point there as well.
And with the shared vision agreement, I think we'd be probably sending the wrong message if we didn't do anything, right? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Mr. Brannigan, could you talk a bit about if God forbid, there is an incident at the border, how the first responders and the kind of coordination you have between first responders and those on the U.S. side, and what kind of coordinated? Is there a formal agreement right now between both sides, or?
Canada or Windsor and Detroit, or
Windsor, Detroit, and yeah.
Well, there is no formal agreement.
Okay.
We are daily integrating our police officers with Americans all the time. We deal with anything that happens at the bridge, anything that happens on the water, anything that happens on land. And like I mentioned earlier, my people, we are the primary policing agency in Windsor in that area. So my people are the ones that do respond to anything. If the bridge was to close for some type of a job action or something like that, vehicles that are on the NAFTA highway stop in Windsor, we have to deal with that traffic situation and things of that nature. We are part of a communications interoperability project right now that was hosted by Homeland Security in the United States for southeastern Michigan and regions encompassing border areas. And my police service does have a member that assists the Americans in writing grants for that radio interoperability opportunity. And money has been flowing into the southeastern Michigan, and those radio systems will be coming right to Windsor and the border. My understanding is right from Sault Ste. Marie to Lake Erie in Ohio.
Thanks very much, Mr. Brannigan. We're out of time. Mr. Randall. Mr. Garrison. Mr. Randall Garrison.
Thank you very much. It's also my first time at the Finance Committee. I sit on the Public Safety Committee, where I would like to have seen all of you, but that's not the way things are working this time. So I want to start with a brief question about this joint enforcement operations under the Shipwriter program. And I guess I have two questions. My previous background, before I was a member of Parliament, I did some international work in review of police accountability. And I guess my question would be, are there not significant differences in things like use of force protocols between Canada and U.S. forces? And how is that going to be resolved operationally? When you say one is under the command of the other, but certainly if that operation were in Canada, they might be might not be familiar with the use of force protocols here? And how would something like that be handled?
Speak specifically to the use of force. When we first piloted Shipwriter, we actually provided a full suite of use of force training from the U.S. side and on the Canadian side. And the feedback we received from participants is that they're so much alike, it was a waste of our time. What we need to understand is the delta between use of force in Canada and use of force in the U.S. And as a consequence, a course training standard has been developed. It's been tested over a number of pilot projects. It's actually seeking federal accreditation in the U.S. Through the FLETC program, the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center. And the course is 8 days, and it's delivered at the Maritime Law Enforcement Academy in Charleston, South Carolina. This is a partnership with the RCMP, U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement and the U.S. Coast Guard to deliver this training. The training, several hours are spent on use of force in order to teach officers what use of force would be, the requirements in Canada, and what the use of force. And in addition, this training that they receive in addition to the theory and the law, they also practice this through a number of scenarios. So a good portion of the training is actually getting out with actors, practicing these use of force models and getting critiqued on them. So there is extensive training in the days leading up to a deployment. In fact, it's a requirement of officers, and it's a requirement in the legislation as well as in the framework agreement, that the officers receive special training before they can receive cross-designation.
It's interesting because in the RCMP Public Complaints Commission report on the G20 summit, it identified significant differences between the RCMP and the Toronto City Police on things like kettling. And one would think the cooperation there would be much closer than Canada and the United States. So if let's say, an American officer in an incident which requires split-second decision-making reverts to the U.S. use of force protocol, what authority would any Canadian accountability mechanism have over them?
The framework agreement sets out the accountability requirements. For criminal misconduct in Canada, Canada would retain jurisdiction and investigate it like any other serious incident. There is for civil liability, there's Canada and the U.S. have to sit down and decide how that would be managed. With respect to discipline of the U.S. officers, that would be managed by the host agency or the contributing agency. So if it was U.S. Coast Guard officer that was found to have committed a discipline violation, they would be dealt with by the U.S. Coast Guard. And then there is the Public Complaints Commission that has oversight of this. In addition, the Commissioner of the RCMP has the authority to suspend and revoke the cross-designation of anybody that he sees fit.
Okay. A very short time, so I'm going to turn very quickly to Mr. Kennedy, who I've met before in other capacities. Some comments you made earlier about the assignment of responsibilities from the Inspector General to CERC. Could you just maybe go over that again? What would be needed, or what do you see it's missing to make that an effective transfer, if that were the right thing to do?
Yeah. Just a brief response, please.
Yes. If you're going to have it be credible, I would have to assume that you'd want to give all the powers that the IG currently has, which includes the power to monitor, which I don't see there. And since they, by monitoring, what they're doing is actually going down and they're looking at operational files, I would assume that you'd want to make sure that CERC had the staff capacity to do that very activity as well, and to ensure that there's no loss of continuity from the work that's been undertaken in the past 28 years. I would assume you'd want to provide that the files be transferred over to CERC as well, so they have the knowledge base. Hopefully they've got some money that they can do it, and that they've got the skill sets then to do it. If you don't do that, you're not consolidating, you're eliminating.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Garrison. Mr. Van Kesteren, please.
Thank you all for appearing tonight, and I want to thank you all for your public service as well, too. Each one of you renders a very important part of service to our community and to our country. Mr. Brannigan, I'm from your neck of the woods, too, Chatham, Ontario, and I appreciate what you're doing there. It's very interesting. Now, I have two sons that are in the Chatham-Kent police force. I'm curious, and I've never talked to them about this, but is this something that Chief Poole is involved with as well, too, or is it strictly stopped at the Windsor border?
Well, to the best of my knowledge, Chief Poole has never engaged in these conversations like this, to the best of my knowledge. I know Chief Poole very well, and we do talk frequently, and we've never had this conversation, he and I.
Okay. Now, I have another son that's an OPP. Now, what about the OPP? Are they involved with the OPP?
The OPP are very well versed with the shipwriter program, and they're very well versed with maritime issues in and around the Windsor area. They do put boats in the water in and around the Windsor area and Chatham area. Lake Erie, Lake St. Clair, and all the way up through most of the lakes, certainly Huron as well.
So inevitably there's going to be a time when somebody's going to get off the boat and is going to hightail it into the land. At that point, what would you engage CK Police Force or the OPP? Would they know about this program too? Are they familiar with it?
They would be familiar with it. I'm sure that they would be. Whether or not they were engaged in it would depend on whether or not the RCMP was floating in those areas, or if they designated other police agencies to participate in the Shipwriter program.
I'll shift some gears. Ms. Launderville, I'm curious what your thoughts are, and give me a State of the Union address, if you would, on the Canadian Housing Authority. We just witnessed a total meltdown in the United States with Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae, and how are we looking as far as are we solid yet? Are we liquid?
We're in very good shape. We never did the silly kinds of lending they did in the United States. Our mortgage arrears rate went up from 0.4 of 1% to 0.5 of 1%, and it's back down to 0.4. So it's not an issue here. It's there's some housing markets that maybe are a little hot, but overall the housing finance system is in very good shape.
It can't just be a hot market. We know that both those institutions made some serious mistakes, but what safeguards do we have in CMHC that would...
Well, because we have the way we have it set up is the government implicitly is backing CMHC. They're backing the private insurers. In order to get that backing, they have to follow the rules that the Minister of Finance sets. And we were looser on our lending criteria when in 2007 than we are now, and they've tightened them up from the length of the amortization period to how much you can borrow to all those kinds of things. So the Minister of Finance can set those criteria, and because you don't get your backing, if you don't meet those criteria, the insurers go along with it. So it's really quite a nicely designed system.
You're critical about the fact that there's 100% backing for the government institution, and whereas privates are 90%, I think. Is that still the case, or has the government listened to some of those concerns?
There's nothing in the bill that addresses that. I think it's, CMHC is 100% backed just because it's a Crown corporation. I think somehow we need to get to a point where everybody has the same backing. It could be 50%. They could spin off the mortgage insurance business out of CMHC and have everybody have a 50% guarantee. I don't care what it is, as long as it's the same for everybody.
What percentage of the market is shared by the public sector?
CMHC has about 70% of the mortgage insurance market.
Is it going down? Is there a percentage going down? It's not. Okay, good. Thank you.
Mr. Van Kesteren, Monsieur May, s'il vous plaît, pour 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Kennedy, I'm really curious because I think Ms. Glover mentioned that the officials, when they were here and when we asked them questions, and I think Ms. Nash has said it, they were basically telling us there was duplication, we just want to make it easier, save a bit of money. But when I read you wrote a piece on May 11th, and it is quite, I would say, alarming in the sense that you are saying that we are cutting the eyes and ears of the minister. Can you again? Maybe that's why it has been put in this bill, and that we at the Finance Committee are looking at it so that we don't really understand what's happening. But I know you've been there. You've worked for 20 years, if I'm not mistaken, in the public security. Can you tell us really? Should we be worried that we're cutting the Inspector General's position and also the role of the Inspector General?
What you should be concerned about is if your primary objective is to get rid of fat within the system to address the deficit problem and things like that, you look at fat, but you're stuck now with a policy issue that you're not equipped by obviously your expertise to look at. Your expertise is in finance, your expertise isn't over here. So you assume, well, yes, there's $1 million, you save $1 million, we're ahead of the game. What you're not being told is, well, why were those structures put in place in the first place? You had about a 2-year-long Royal Commission of Inquiry headed by a Superior Court judge, where you had criminal charges laid against people. You had a unique combined House of Commons Senate committee sitting to craft the CSIS legislation. We were one of the first to create legislation to set out a mandate for an intelligence service in the world. So we were unique in that way. We addressed the problem, said there was a problem, we're going to take care of it. And there were abuses. So now you have a regime that you have no background on, no knowledge on, where there's a series of calls by various commissions and even some oversight bodies to strengthen the regime. You do nothing to strengthen the regime, and yet here you are pulling away a piece without realizing what you're doing. Now, it's eyes and ears because, as I said, and I'm not exaggerating, the minister is personally accountable for those intelligence officers. He is made, that was the way the model was, because the public can't be involved in it. So the public's assurances are that we have a responsible minister, and he's on the hook for this, and he's informed and can do the job and deliver it for us. With the RCMP, they're independent in terms of who they investigate and when. If they get in trouble, it's all in the public. It plays on the public. This is a covert intelligence agency. So these vehicles are put in there to allow the minister to control it so that he can give the public the assurances. Now, one of the tools that's there is being removed. Now, what you have to remember, fine, I've dealt with CSIS for a long time, and I have many friends there, and I admire them. But I'll say the same thing to my colleagues at the RCMP, who I dealt with 36 years, who wanted to be involved in what oversight powers they had. I said the horse doesn't get to select the saddle. The mounties don't decide who has oversight of them and to what extent. And for anyone to sit here and possibly think because CSIS doesn't like this, CSIS should be accommodated and remove it is sheer insanity. It really is. They don't get to make that call. Your job is to give the public the assurances and make sure the tools are there to give it. If you come up with a better model, fine, but do it in a comprehensive fashion. Don't do it as a money-saving effort because CSIS wants it and it looks like it's easy. That would be, with the greatest respect, the height of your responsibility. It really would be.
You say here in your piece, the minister is responsible for a portfolio which employs some 40,000 individuals, of which CSIS is one portion. How can he possibly fulfill his responsibilities to the public and ensure that CSIS hasn't stepped over the line? And your answer is the reality is he cannot.
He personally cannot. That's why he needs tools there. He needs someone whose job and who's accountable to the minister. Your job is, when I make, as the minister, I give a ministerial direction or I approve a policy, someone's got to make sure these guys adhere to that. And if they don't, I want to know because my neck is on the line as the minister because I'm giving assurances to Parliament, I'm giving assurances to the public. Parliament has no access to that information. Parliament has to take the assurances to the minister. If the minister is not in a position to give the assurances, how Parliament is weakened. You can't do your job. And this is the same Parliament that had been asking for years to have a parliamentary committee to do oversight of the CSIS, which would be very difficult to do because it's highly classified operational information. So we have this interim step. That's why it's there.
Just very quickly, because you mentioned...
Mr. Maya, actually, you're over time, but there may be time for another round. So we'll come back to you. Ms. Glover, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to say, Mr. Garrison, you're welcome to come to Finance Committee. It's nice to see other members attend. However, it's ridiculous to think that with all the experience that's here in this room, that the Public Safety Committee somehow would have some alternate questions. And to compare kettling, which is a crowd control technique, I have 19 years in the police service, I intend to go back. It's a technique that can be chosen to be used in whatever police service chooses to use it, but the use of force continuum is not something that you can defer from. It is something that actually judicially is measured if you do not follow it, and it must be followed consistently. So to compare apples to oranges and then pretend like you know what you're talking about is, frankly, disrespectful to the members of the Finance Committee. Nevertheless, I'm going to continue with our officers in uniform. I'm very pleased with the pilot project that was held. And I'd really like for you to express to us the successes with the pilot project so that we can kind of envision, how we might see this play out.
With respect to the 2007 pilot projects that were the longer-term pilots, two of them were run concurrently, one on the West Coast and one on the St. Lawrence Seaway in the area of Cornwall. The pilots were involved, the officers involved, and the shipwrighter teams were involved in a number of interdictions and arrests. They were involved in 6 direct arrests, and they contributed to 40-some other arrests. They were involved in the seizure of contraband cigarettes, marijuana, the confiscation of proceeds of crime, vessels that were used for cross-border smuggling and modified for those purposes, as well as conveyances on land they contributed. In addition, they coordinated with land resources, so as had been alluded to by Deputy Chief Brannigan, that when these operations are deployed, there's often contact with the land resources. And in one case in Cornwall, there was a complaint of an abducted child that that was in the border zone, and a vessel had been used. So the shipwrighter team had the operational flexibility to cross back and forth, checking marinas along the Canada-U.S. border on both sides of the border, which then helped them quickly identify where the vessel had landed, and helped identify the vehicle, which ultimately led to the safe return of a child. So they were seen as contributing to that investigation as well. So these are some, just to highlight some of the successes that we've seen with the deployment of shipwrighter along our shared waterways with our American counterparts.
Which is fantastic, and good job, and kudos to those who were involved. I do have a bit of time. I want to clear up some other misinformation while I'm at it, simply because I actually am married to a police officer who's retired, who spent much of his life doing intelligence work, and spent the last 5 years of his life in surveillance following some of our biker gangs. In any event, I'm very familiar with CSIS. I'm very familiar with CERC. What I do want to share with those who are watching is, as police officers, we never assume things. We never assume unless we take the time to hear both sides of it, which is why I'm so disappointed in Mr. Kennedy's testimony when he says he hasn't heard the officials. Let me tell him and all Canadians watching, what the officials had to say about what's going on. The minister himself supports this legislation. The minister is very cognizant of the fact that quite often there are criticisms, and so the review is now going to be consolidated within CERC because it's at arm's length from the government. That is what's so important here. It's at arm's length, which is more transparency, more independence. There's duplication because both CSIS and CERC were doing self-initiated reviews of CSIS activities. And so it's important that people know that one side of the story is not being told here. And this is a measure that will take some money that's being saved and allocate it, which is what was told by the officials. So the assumption that there will be no transfer is wrong as well. I know myself, and I'm sure, Mr. Oliver, you know, when the chief of police puts his trust in the folks that are working around him, and there are mistakes made, and Mr. Kennedy said clearly mistakes are inevitable. He said are inevitable, especially with intelligence people. The chief is not forced to resign if mistakes are made. We all do the best we can because the interest of the public safety is what's important. And so would you confirm for me, Mr. Oliver and Mr. Brannigan, mistakes are made within the policing community, within the public security. Would you fire the chief or the commissioner if a mistake was made down the line, knowing everyone's making their utmost attempts at doing the right thing?
Well, I mean, I'd be speaking to hypothetical, and I think everything is fact-based. So, to suggest that there may be circumstances when the head of the organization failed to exercise leadership to control misconduct, may result in some sort of discipline or firing.
So you have to go case by case. Wouldn't that be right? Wouldn't that be right? Wouldn't you have to go case by case and look at the facts of the story, look at both sides of the story before you demand someone's resignation?
We believe mistakes are a foundation for growth. And in policing, when you have persons, I call it calls under your belt, you need to acquire calls under your belt as a police officer to make better decisions as time goes on. You can only train so much, and you can only experience training so much. You must deploy, and you must make those decisions. When the decisions get to a stage where there could be a criminal result or misconduct, we do have circumstances where that does happen.
Thank you. Unfortunately, we are out of time on that round. We'll go to Mr. Hoback, please.
Chair, I must say, I feel like I'm the last guy at a prayer breakfast or a prayer meeting. There's no good prayers left to say. But having said that, there's a couple questions maybe I'll look at. Mr. Oliver and I'm just looking at the pilot project that was being done along the border. Are you extending that project now into Saskatchewan, Alberta, the prairies? Have you done similar pilot projects outside of that region?
I think there's a misunderstanding with respect to the current status of the pilot projects. There are no pilot projects underway today. The pilot projects were very short duration to test a concept. And then in order to continue with the type of work that was underway and, following the framework agreement, there's a requirement for legislation in order for us to operationalize this on a more routine basis. So in the absence of legislation, we're not in a position to continue conducting shipwriter operations. So it's a missed opportunity if we fail to get this legislative tool.
That would explain then why it's part of the budget and the implications, of course, cost-wise or looking at the cost to trade, for example. By not having programs like this in place, we'd have to control things in a lot more severe manner. Would that not be fair to say on our side, which would be restrictive to trade and the flow of goods? Would that be?
I think this tool will provide us greater operational flexibility in the border environment, and it helps us better leverage each other's resources while respecting each country's sovereignty.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Launderville, with CMHC, the changes you see now in the budget there, would you not agree that's going to provide even better oversight on CMHC and the activities that CMHC are involved with? Yes, okay. Chair, I think I'm going to leave it at that.
I'll take the rest of your time.
Sure.
Okay, there's 3 minutes left.
In the 3 minutes I have left, I do want to take a moment to thank all of you for your service, and that includes everyone on the panel, Ms. Launderville, Mr. Kennedy, et cetera. I want to make a comment, though, that the Budget Implementation Act includes these measures because we believe sincerely that they are the right measures to protect the interests of Canadians, that they're the right measures to protect the interests of our law enforcement community and the people who would be working in CERC. And so, having said that, I'd like to offer, I know, Mr. Zaguer, you haven't had much opportunity to speak, but I would like to offer you the opportunity to close here today and tell us why it's important that these measures be put in this Budget Implementation Act, the first one, rather than the fall session, and how this will actually improve and enhance security for Canadians.
Well, it's always up to the government when to introduce a bill and how to introduce it. And in fact, this particular legislation, this is the third time it comes before Parliament. It was once before Parliament in the House of Commons, introduced in the House, died very shortly after being introduced, and then it was introduced in the Senate and died again when the last election was called. So we're all fingers crossed on this one because, frankly, I think we all believe it to be a very good initiative. I'll just hit a few points. We don't have any shipwriter operations at present. We've had a number of shipwriter pilots, 2005 and 2007. You've heard those described. But we've also deployed shipwriter operations. We called them marine security operations in support of a number of important cross-border maritime or with events that had perhaps a maritime component. The Olympics in Vancouver, the G20 and G20 in Toronto last year, and also the Super Bowl that was in Detroit back in 2006, January of 2006. So it's had the people who have been involved in it have had numerous opportunities to perfect it, to improve the training, and they're becoming quite adept at the training. The RCMP has a fairly large number of people already trained. The Coast Guard has to retrain, the U.S. Coast Guard has to retrain a number of its people because they get redeployed after a number of years. And so the training is constantly, it's ongoing. And the other point I want to make was
just
that...
very briefly, sir.
Very brief. And that is...
If the U.S. has enabling legislation already gone through.
Okay.
The U.S. Did not enact any legislation. They're using something called Title 19, which is part of their customs. That's how the officers in Windsor get the authority to carry a firearm into the U.S. But the one point I wanted to make was that we engaged with public safety in consultations back in, I think it was 2008. And one of the most important things that come out of that was the fact that those consulted, the attorneys general, the lawyers, others, all wanted the Americans to be subject to our law. Not only enforce our law, but be subject to it as well.
Thank you. Thank you. We'll go to Mr. Garrison again, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. It's a little hard to resist some of the darts that were flung in this direction earlier, but I think it illustrates that if these matters were before the Public Safety Committee, members have a chance to get to know each other a bit better and to know their background and expertise. And I can assure Ms. Glover that I do have some background in use of force protocols as a UN observer and as an Amnesty International observer working with the police academy in Afghanistan. And so I think it just once again illustrates that if these matters were before the proper committee, we wouldn't have these little exchanges where people don't know each other well and don't really know the background. I want to return to Mr. Kennedy and ask him a little bit about the existing CIRC committee. My understanding of the committee composed of part-time members with no particular expertise, with very limited staff support. And so what we're talking about, as you mentioned earlier, is transferring some very large responsibilities. Could you say something about that kind of difference of role and the different kind of people that are on the CIRC committee as opposed to an inspector general?
Well, I think that is part of the problem. I'm sure they're all very competent people. I said that vis-a-vis my successor, who just didn't happen to have any background in criminal law but had a background in state planning. So don't come to me for state planning, but come to me for criminal law, go to him for state planning. I noticed there's at least two people who are still left who are MDs, so I really couldn't see the relationship. They're distinguished people, but I would have thought that maybe the CIRC itself would benefit from someone who had a background in something akin to national security in one form or another. The analogy I've used before is if you want to have credible oversight, the analogy I used is with a race car, and I think it's appropriate. If you want to win a race, what do you need? You need three things. You need a car that's got a powerful engine. That's a legislative mandate. You got to have fuel. That's money. And you have to have a highly skilled driver. You put those things together, you win the race. If you want to have credible oversight, you have to have those three things. And there have been some very distinguished people who have certainly sat on CIRC that I have great respect for. But at times it looks like it's an afterthought. It shouldn't be an afterthought that you don't have a chair, a permanent chair of CIRC right now. I don't know what kind of message that sends to the public. So you're eliminating the IG's office because the IG hasn't been replaced. You're eliminating that office, and you don't have a chair for CIRC. And the reality is you have 4 people who I believe have full-time jobs who come in part-time doing this. What does that send as a signal to the Canadian population about a domestic intelligence agency? It's a very, very poor signal.
Thank you.
2 minutes.
One of the other things that you touched upon, I think, is the importance of oversight for having credibility for not just the minister, but for the institution. And for I would also add getting public cooperation with an agency like CISA. So if you don't have public confidence in the oversight, is this likely to affect the amount of cooperation that the public gives to the agency?
One of the challenges we dealt with, and the service would be dealing with today, is the vast bulk of people who come to this country as new Canadians, come from parts of the world where the intelligence services are very, very unpleasant folk. And it's hard to get out of their mind that mindset when they come over here and deal with us. Our intelligence service is different. They don't assume that. So you do need their cooperation in terms of dealing with homegrown threats and things of that nature. If you want to find out, look at the submission, as I pointed out, that CISA itself made to the Arar Commission Inquiry in Part 2, where it talked about in the early days, and I was there, very rough relationships between them and CIRC. Those improved over time because they realized the value of having an independent third party who could speak to the public with some credibility. But that means you better staff that vehicle in such a way that it is credible. Mandate, fuel, money, and personnel that have the right competencies, not long CVs, not sitting there drooling because their best days are behind them, someone with a bit of vigor who knows what this is about and knows how to articulate that. That is the best way of enhancing the credibility of CSIS in Canada with the Canada that we have today.
And so would you say that would make CSIS a more effective force?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Colleagues, we are on the agenda. It says until 8:30. We will have bells sometime after 8, and then at that time we will suspend. But at this point, we'll keep going, and yes, we'll adjourn at that point. But I just wanted to let you know I will continue until that time. And I wanted to ask Ms. Launderville a few questions here. And I appreciate your support for the measures in the bill with respect to more transparency and accountability and moving the enhanced role for OSFI in terms of housing and CMHC. You state in your presentation you'd like to see a full analysis of the differences, though, in coverage between the private and public insurers before we argue one deserves a different backing than the other. Can you just, who would you recommend should do that analysis?
It's not very complicated, right? You're really just spreading out all the loans on a map and seeing if there's a difference in the coverage. So I don't. Yeah, it could be anybody. It could be an academic. Or it could be, the private insurers' data is basically public, so you get the data from the two and you merge them and see if there's differences.
And I just wanted you to expand it because, CMHC does make the point that they have sort of this, they're a bit of a hybrid in terms of an agency, in terms of their social housing role. So can you just respond fully in terms of their argument that they are different in kind from a company like Genworth?
They are, but they're not. Should they be using their mortgage insurance revenues to fund those other activities? They don't really. They get an appropriation from the government for social housing programs and that sort of thing. So I don't see that that the fact that they do housing policy and affordable housing and work in that area, to me that's totally separate from the fact that they do mortgage insurance, which is a profit-making venture for them. And I don't think one should subsidize the other. I think we should be explicitly saying, this is what we want to do in terms of housing policy. Let's fund it out of government revenues. And mortgage insurance is a separate issue.
Okay. And can I ask, are there any, as you know, the government has made a number of steps in terms of sort of trying to ensure that there's no housing bubble here in Canada. You've referenced the fact that we have not had a housing crisis here like they've had in the U.S. From a policy point of view, is there anything further we should be looking at?
We've tightened up the lending requirements quite a lot. If you're buying a property to rent to other people, for example, you can only get an 80% loan on that, and you used to be able to borrow 95%. So we've gotten, I don't think we need to go, we don't want to tighten them so far that we cause a downturn in the housing market. That would be disastrous.
Okay. And I think my final question here is the proposed changes to the covered bonds. Can you talk in terms of how it's affecting or will affect, in your view, the financing costs and mortgage rates? Will there be any impact?
Well, really, covered bonds are a way for banks, financial institutions to bring in more funds. So by having the legislation there, they can package their mortgages. They keep them on, basically, they're keeping those mortgages. It's not like they're selling them into mortgage-backed securities. They're issuing a bond that's backed by those mortgages and bringing in funds. So the fact that they can't put insured loans in there might mean they have to pay a little more interest on them, but it will bring in additional funds into that they can then use for lending, including lending for mortgages. So I think overall it's a positive thing. And as I say, that some people can't invest in those unless there is legislation in the government, government legislation. So
I appreciate that. I was going to give the rest of this round to Mr. Jean. You had a short question, please.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Kennedy, you had mentioned that that somebody would talk to you about criminal law, and I was wondering how many years you practiced criminal law.
I was a lawyer with the Department of Justice for 25 years, and I started off as a criminal prosecutor in Toronto for about 8 years, and then I picked it up again as the Senior General Counsel for the Federal Prosecution Service. I was responsible for the criminal prosecutions in Canada in terms of drugs, proceeds of crime, money laundering, those things.
And actually, it says that in your bio, and now, which is on the website in front of me. Thanks very much, Mr. Bryson.
And of course, having 4+ years on the as chairman of the commission, one has to refresh one's knowledge of criminal law.
Absolutely, and you were reappointed once by this government.
Twice
by this government. That's right. And in your thank you. And in your time as a prosecutor, did you ever lose any cases?
Some, but usually I could convict you.
Well, that begs the question, what do you know about me?
It's the equivalent to the French "on" is in one.
Yes, thank you very much. I appreciate that. I've never been convicted nor charged, so I just want to say that for the record. As I said, I was a criminal lawyer, but not a criminal and a lawyer at the same time. And that was my point. The one thing I do know, and I have a short period of time, is that in every room that has 2 lawyers, there will be 3 opinions. And one will be on one side, one will be on the other, and one will be somewhere in between. Thank you.
That was what they said about economists, that they predicted 12 of the last 5 recessions. Thank you. Mr. Bryson, you'll probably have a couple of minutes. Once the bells ring, I will adjourn.
Thank you very much. Question on the mortgage policies. When did 40-year no down payment mortgages, when were they first introduced in Canada?
It was the mid-2000s. They weren't around for very, very long.
Around 2000.
2004, 2005, something like that. And they were only there for 2 years, maybe.
Yeah, it was actually 2006.
Okay, so there you go.
Yeah, it was 2006. So there was a big take-up on them at the time.
There was, yeah.
And I think at the time around 40% of first-time mortgages fell in that category.
I don't know that percentage, but I wouldn't be surprised. I know Genworth, I saw some stats from Genworth where they had done quite a third of theirs were 40 years in the year that I was looking at.
And so they were introduced in 2006, and the decision to reduce the amortization period came about after the global financial crisis?
Yeah, I think 2008 was the drop to 35 years, and 2010 to 30 years, something like that.
Now, The Economist magazine has pointed to evidence that in some markets in Canada we may have a housing bubble. And there's been also, Governor Carney has spoken not of a housing bubble, but a personal debt bubble. Do you see the personal debt bubble as being closely related to debt on housing and particularly lines of credit based on, or home equity lines of credit?
Well, the split between personal debt and mortgage debt is about the same as, the whole pie has grown, but the split's still about the same as it was. So it's not that people are borrowing just to buy houses now or just on their credit cards.
No, but existing homes, as value has gone up in some markets, we've been told by several witnesses that a lot of the personal debt that has led to Canadians having the largest level of personal debt in Canadian history, and it's $1.50 of personal debt per dollar of annual earnings, which is higher than the Americans at this stage. But there is a relationship with housing prices and valuations from that.
One of the restrictions recently was that if you are refinancing your house now, you used to be able to borrow 95%, so you could take out all the equity you'd built up in that house. Now it's 85%. So
for a brief period of time, you could borrow 100%
I suppose,
from 2006 to 2008. And so with that level of debt bubble, personal debt bubble, and with its relationship with housing prices, isn't it, I mean, I guess I'm wondering whether you can be comfortable in saying there's no housing bubble in Canada. Do you see in some markets perhaps a housing bubble in some of the larger
Mr. Bryson,
markets?
unfortunately, the bells are ringing.
But
yeah. I will just remind members, we are sitting tomorrow night from 6 to 9 p.m. Just please watch for all the agendas and notices. I want to thank our witnesses for being with us here tonight. We appreciate your time very much and responding to our questions. Thank you. Meeting adjourned.